Good evening, friends. It's been a little while, and I thought it was time to do another response video. I've had this one on my list for some time now. Well, actually, when was this video released? Oh, okay, 7 months ago, so a little while. I have not watched it yet, so this will be a live response. We'll see how we go. I'm going to be responding to this video here. Why is it still loading? What's happening here? On Majesty of Reason's channel, every objection to dualism debunked, because it's in capitals, so clearly that's being yelled. This is an interview with Brian Cutter, philosopher who's written about dualism as well as psychophysical harmony. And I thought it might be interesting to take a look. So welcome everyone as you come in. Glad you could make it. Hopefully this will be an interesting one. I don't think it will come to many if any of our listeners as a surprise to know that I am very dubious about substance dualism or even the coherence of the position, let alone the plausibility of it. So I think Brian Cutters here is going to be going through some of the standard objections, like the pairing problem, causal, exclusion, conservation of energy, and such. So let's see what he has to say in response.
As Joe
mentioned, if he can give a defense of dualism that I'll find compelling.
We'll be looking at objections to dualism and going through some of the main responses, including some commentary of what I take to be the best responses. So just to start out, we've got this kind of standard distinction between property dualism and substance dualism. So property dualism says basically there are two kinds of fundamental properties, physical and mental. Substance dualism.
Thanks very much, Modern Atheism. What's PPH? I haven't watched his debate with Opti yet. There are two kinds of
concrete things, physical and mental. As I use the terms, property dualism is the more inclusive view. So substance dualism will be a version of property dualism, but one can be a property dualist while also being a substance monist. So maybe there's just physical substances, but some of those physical substances like brains or living bodies have two kinds of properties, physical and mental. So I'll try to note where it's relevant, this distinction along the way. Some of these objections just target substance dualism, some target the weaker thesis of property dualism. So
one of the problems with substance dualism right off the bat is that I think that there's really a lack of clarity as to what exactly the distinction is between a physical substance and a mental substance. A mental substance is supposed to be something like a soul. I think Brian uses that terminology as well. But we'll see if he gets to this objection, but what exactly constitutes a mental substance that differentiates it from a physical substance and means it isn't a physical substance? Yeah, I think that it's actually very hard to do that in a way that makes much of any sense. I think you end up just saying that it has mental properties, but it just isn't physical because it just doesn't count as physical without really giving a theory as to make that principled. Anyway. Oh, psychophysical harmony. I've not seen it abbreviated, PPH. Yeah, so Nathan and I did a bad apologetics on psychophysical harmony years ago, but I think it does require another response. I think it's a very silly argument, but it interacts with positions about from philosophy of mind and consciousness and so forth. So there's relationship.
Jumping right in, probably the most famous objection to dualism. Well, so we're going to go through a lot of objections that have to do with different worries about causal interaction in one way or another between immaterial minds and material bodies. There's different flavors of this objection. So there's one category of objection that we'll call the interaction problem or the interaction problems, which mainly target substance dualism, the idea that there's like an immaterial mind or soul that interacts with your physical body. Where the interaction problem just says, well, if your mind is this immaterial thing, presumably in order to explain the correlations between mind and body, like the correlations between your states of consciousness and your brain states, we're going to have to posit some kind of causal interaction between those two elements. But for various reasons, it has been argued that an immaterial mind couldn't interact with a physical body or brain. Different reasons have been given for this, so let's look at a few possible reasons. So sometimes the rhetoric around this says something like, well, according to substance dualism, mind and body are fundamentally different kinds of things. So how could they possibly interact? Where the underlying assumption seems to be that if you've got two things that are very, very different, they couldn't interact. I don't think this is a very serious worry. I mean, I don't know, you can put a banana in a toaster and I bet they'll causally interact, but bananas and toasters are very different kinds of things.
Well, I agree that this is not the strongest form of the objection, but like that response is bizarre because bananas and, well, what was it? A toast? Well, what did he say? Bananas and what?
very, very different, they couldn't interact. I don't think this is a very serious worry. I mean, I don't know, you can put a banana in a toaster and I bet they'll causally interact.
Oh, banana in a toaster, right. But I mean, bananas and toast are both and toasters, I should say, are both made of atoms, right? So souls aren't supposed to be made of atoms, and I think that that is plausibly relevant as to giving an account as to how souls. I'm just going to use the word soul to refer to the immaterial mind. How a soul could interact with, say, a brain. It is rather more of a higher order problem, like a more complex issue, a more difficult problem to resolve than how two different objects that are made of atoms, like made of the same fundamental thing, could interact with each other. Now, this is one of my main objections to substance dualists and substance dualism and the sorts of arguments that substance dualists give, is because I don't know that I've actually found any exceptions to this. I'm sure there's some, but every single time they say anything about physical science or the nature of the material world or the brain or neuroscience or anything like that, they talk at the absolute highest level of generality that they possibly can and don't actually get into any details. I suspect because a lot of them don't know or care very much about science. There may be some exceptions, as I said, but that's just my impression. This is, we're like 1 minute in and already we've seen this. Like the idea that there's an objection here that souls and brains are supposed to be fundamentally different kinds of things, or made of fundamentally different kinds of things. And so there's a prima facie problem of how they could interact. What are the principles that mediate that sort of causal connection? And his response, Brian's response, is to say, well, bananas and toasters interact, and they're very different. So it's plausible that souls and brains can interact as well. But Brian, bananas and toasters are both made of atoms. They're both baryonic matter, comprised of baryonic matter. We know the principles behind which they can interact with each other. We don't know anything about the principles of how this immaterial soul, whatever it's supposed to be, could interact with a physical brain. I'll develop that criticism further, but just highlighting here that he seems to have completely missed the point of what I think the concern is. That bananas and toasters are not made of fundamentally different things, whereas souls and brains are, and that's the crux of the issue. I don't really understand how he can sort of miss that so fundamentally.
But bananas and toasters are very different kinds of things. Okay, that's a little bit cheeky, because you might say, well, they're made of some of the same kinds of elementary particles.
Yeah, you might say that.
But even at the level of elementary particles, you could have an elementary particle that has mass, like an electron, interact with a massless particle, like a photon. I mean, these things happen. It's fine. It's fine for very different kinds of things.
Well, I'll let him.
It's fine for fields to interact with particles. I don't see any particular worry here.
Okay, well, let me explain the worry. So let's take that example of a photon and an electron. So a photon is, I've been doing some reading about this for my podcast, actually. Go back to my physics days. But the photon is what's called a gauge boson. It's a particular type of particle that mediates the electromagnetic force. We have a very detailed and intricate theory as part of the standard model, quantum electrodynamics, that explains how this happens. We can write down equations in the form of a Lagrangian that describes the energy of certain types of interactions and how the photon mediates the electromagnetic force between electrons. So we can say exactly how and why at various levels of detail, right from the quantum field theory up through to ordinary everyday observations about how material objects interact with each other, and the chemistry and biology and whatever. We have many different levels of science that allows us to understand this. So on the one hand, we can understand and say why these things interact with each other. And that's actually the problem, because souls just don't fit into that at all. We have no theory of souls, or what they are, or how they interact, or how they could interact. The substance dualists just sort of say that they do, and then wave their hands when anyone raises objections. It's oh, well, they could. Well, okay, maybe hypothetically they could, but you don't actually have a theory as to actually put any detail in that or to articulate that. And that's really the issue. Because you see, we have a detailed theory about how brains work, and there's just no place for souls in there. We'll come to that later, I think, more with causal exclusion. But I think that this is the better way to frame this objection. We know a lot about how causation works in the material world and between material objects. And there's just no room for souls in there. We have absolutely no idea or theory as to how that could happen. There's no like space where you can just interact an electron or a photon with a soul. There's no room for that in our physical theories, and there's no philosophical even attempt to construct such a theory that I'm aware of. So this is the problem. They are fundamentally different types of things, and everything we know about how physical causation works just doesn't have room for the sorts of causal interactions that the dualists postulate. And I think that this is a massive problem for the theory. It doesn't prove that the theory is wrong, because of course there could be a type of interaction that we just know nothing about. But I think that it really weighs against the plausibility that there's just absolutely no even postulated or contemplated type of mechanism that could explain this, or no way that it could interface with our existing theories. Oh, I just moved out the tab.
Serious version of the interaction problem, or serious argument that they couldn't interact, invokes what I'll call a locality principle, which says that causal interaction requires spatial contact. So a version of this worry was famously raised by Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia in her letter correspondence with Descartes. She raised this as a challenge, or a question anyway, for Cartesian dualism. But if we wanted to put it in the form of an objection, we would say, look, if you've got an immaterial mind and a material body, they couldn't interact because causal interaction requires spatial contact. This at least seems to be the way it works in large swaths of the physical world. If you want, one billiard ball to directly affect the motion of another billiard ball.
As far as we know, all causation requires, I wouldn't necessarily say physical contact, because it sort of requires a notion of what you mean by contact, but it requires physical continuity. It requires that two objects be in the same spatiotemporal location, or like as close as you can define that. That's a crucial principle in special relativity, right? That you can't have causal effect mediated over distances that are too far apart, such that light couldn't, such that it would require a signal to travel faster than light in order to get from like one location to another. So all of the types of causation that we know need to be mediated by forces, and those forces all travel at or below the speed of light. And so this notion of physical continuity and the locality of the physical forces that we know about, that they act locally, is central to modern physics. I mean, there's of course some dispute about the correlations between entangled particles in quantum mechanics, but as far as I can tell, pretty much everyone agrees that that's not a causal interaction. It depends how you interpret quantum mechanics. Anyway, the point is that this notion of the locality of causality is pretty central. It's central to physics, and so I think it's not just a principle. He's sort of painting it as a principle that like normally holds, but I mean, I don't know of any exceptions to this.
It's got to be by way of spatial contact. Maybe the cue ball can affect the 8-ball in an indirect way, but it's going to be by chains of spatial contact. It knocks into this ball, which knocks into that ball, and so forth. And so generalizing from these mundane cases, you might think that any case of causal interaction requires something like spatial contact. So we'll call this the locality principle, where the thought is, well, immaterial minds being immaterial, they're not the sorts of things that are located in space or have spatial extension. And so they're not the right kinds of things that could make spatial contact with, say, the matter of the brain. Few different responses that we could give to this. I'll just kind of go through the menu of options. So one response that some substance dualists like is what I'll call the ghost model of the soul, which says, look, the soul, or the immaterial mind, even though it's immaterial, it does have some properties that are characteristic of material things. In particular, it's got spatial extension, or at least spatial location. And so it can just make spatial contact with the matter of the brain, and thereby kind of push it around, or maybe have its states pushed around by the matter of the brain in the other direction. I don't particularly like this way of thinking about the soul. I don't know.
Oh, good, because it's I've seen other dualists make this argument, but I think it's a terrible argument. It makes absolutely no sense to me to say that the soul can have a physical location that is sort of coextensive with the body, or co-located with the body, because that means that the soul must be subject to all of the same physical forces that keep the body physically located in the position that it is. And now the soul just sounds like that it interacts with all of the physical forces that the body does. It starts to sound like it's just another physical thing, or in fact, just exactly the same as the body. I don't think that response can possibly work for the substance dualist. So it's interesting to see that he rejects that. What's the second response?
Objections to it, it strikes me as a little bit silly, but I don't have much more to say against it than that. I mean, it does straightforwardly answer this challenge. I mean, there would be a question of, so on this view, like the soul kind of hovers around and follows around the brain or the body, and you would want some kind of theory as to like how it consistently moves with the body, so as not to be left behind when the body moves. So anyway, there would be some work to be done for this theory, but I don't see any knockdown objections to it. Another,
yeah, I can probably add in there a little bit. I mean, we would want some sort of account of, well, firstly, like, is it extended versus is it like a point? So like that's a choice point.
I think it would have to be extended on this picture, because if it's if it's going to affect the matter in the brain, I mean, I guess if it was like punctate, if it was a point, it could maybe affect the matter at that particular point without
it could jump around really quickly. And
but presumably, like in order to like,
well, how does it stay co-located with the brain? Is my
matter
issue.
to mind causation. Like your state of consciousness is going to be sensitive not just to what matter is doing at any particular point, but to kind of global distributed patterns of processing. So you're probably going to want extension. But yeah, then there's a question of like what exactly is its extension?
Yeah, what are its boundaries? And then you get all these worries about vagueness. And anyway, you raise a lot of additional worries and puzzles for the view if you take this. And maybe that's one way to precisify the kind of ickiness reaction that you had. But I also share the kind of ickiness reaction.
Yeah. So anyway, let's look at some other options and see if we can do better. So another response historically to this kind of worry, which is basically Leibniz's response, is to deny that there is any interaction between mind and matter, because minds are not the sorts of things that can be located in space, and you want to accept locality. This, by the way, is not exactly Leibniz's motivation, but this could be a motivation for a no interaction. But you can say, well, mind and matter just don't causally interact. Okay, you can't be done there because, again, there are these like obvious correlations between states of mind or states of consciousness on the one hand and physical states of your brain and body on the other. You're going to have to explain these correlations. They're not just a fluke. And so, Leibniz's picture is one of pre-established harmony. Basically, God set things up from the beginning, so as to ensure that mind and matter always march in step. Okay, so this I think just absolutely does not work as a response to the locality version of the interaction problem, because on this view you require God to causally influence matter so as to ensure a harmonious correspondence between the behavior of matter and the behavior of mind. But that interaction itself violates locality because God himself is an immaterial being not located in space. And so if he's going to push matter around, that's going to be a case of...
I thought God was sort of everywhere at once. I suppose that depends on who you ask. Let's not get into that right now.
Causal interaction without spatial contact. Now you could say, well, God is special, which presumably he is. And so maybe the rules for divine causation are not the same as the rules for creaturely causation. But by the same token, you could say, well, immaterial minds are special. And so maybe those don't follow the same rules that are followed by kind of intraphysical causation. That brings us to the third response, which is my preferred response, which is to just deny the locality condition on causation. So you say, well, it might be true in many cases, but it's not true as a universal metaphysical principle that wherever there's causal interaction, that goes by way of spatial contact. So
This is exactly what I mean by the substance dualists, right? They just always get out of every objection by just inventing special rules that their own special invented immaterial mind play by. This is exactly what I mean here. Like, first of all, locality doesn't even clearly hold within the physical domain. Entangled particles do not causally interact with each other. This is just what I was saying before. It's a correlation, not causal, and that's critical for special relativity, that be the case. So I'm not aware of any established exceptions to the locality principle. So I guess by clearly he means that, there's some debate about it. I wouldn't really make any defense of substance dualism contingent on that, because that seems like rather a large leap, or like staking a very strong claim there. But the second point here, even if it does, so he's sort of going both ways here. Why can't mind-matter interaction play by different rules? Locality isn't a conceptual truth. I have more to say about this locality isn't a conceptual truth, but because I think that there's actually very good physical reasons to think that it is. Well, not exactly conceptual truth, but causal interaction relates very closely to conservation of energy. And when you sort of formalize that rigorously, the idea is that you describe conservation of energy locally with like local perturbations of energy moving in sort of space-time, and you can then derive that you'll have sorry, what was I saying there? Yeah, so conservation of energy relates very closely to the fact that there is symmetry of to conservation laws relate very closely to symmetries in the physical world, which is what I was trying to say. And the symmetries that we observe are like a symmetry of the laws of nature in time or in space. So like different locations in space have the same physical laws, or different time periods have the same physical laws. So those symmetries give rise to conservation laws, like conservation of energy, symmetry in time, conservation of momentum, symmetry in space. And then those conservation laws, this is what I was trying to say before, are expressed locally in terms of the invariance of the system as you describe it in different ways, and then as you like move through space and time. Anyway, not really explaining that very well, but the point is that there are deep reasons to think that locality is connected to that, and that in turn connects to causation, because causation is related to the exchange of conserved quantities through local interactions. So while not being strictly conceptual truth, I think there's very good reasons to think that there's very good theoretical reasons to think that locality is pretty fundamental to our universe. And so whilst it is possible that an immaterial soul could play by different rules, what reason do we think that it does? Or to put it another way, everything we know about how causation works in the world says that it works this way. And the substance dualists are saying, but my pet preferred theory of mind says that it has to work another way. So I'm just going to declare that it does. Now, in my view, that is very implausible and requires me to have very good reasons and evidence to admit this exception. But they don't actually have any, right? Like there's no reason to think that this is an exception. They're just declaring that it has to be an exception to defend their theory. And from my experience, this is what you see in all of the responses to substance dualist theories, is basically just, well, yes, that would be an exception. That would be an objection, except I have a get out of jail free card, which just says that it's different, or it just works that way, or it just has these properties that are necessary. Anyway, so let me...
A couple things to say here. First, locality doesn't even clearly hold within the physical domain. So there's the much discussed case of entangled particles and the sorts of phenomena associated with Bell's inequality in the philosophy of quantum mechanics that, there's a lot of debate about how to interpret what's going on here. But at least one popular interpretation here is that you have some kind of non-local influence of like one entangled particle on another space-like separated entangled particle where that's not mediated by any kind of spatial contact.
Who the hell is saying that that's a causal interaction? Yes, there are correlations there, and there's questions about how to interpret those. But a causal interaction violates relativity theory, which, I mean, the vast majority of physicists are not very happy to just dispense with that. Relativity is one of our best. Well, actually, that's sort of it gets at the heart of what I'm saying here. Relativity theory is one of the best theories that we have in terms of how rigorously it's been tested. And one of the key precepts of relativity theory is that there is no causal interactions that are possible that would require, or that would violate locality, that would require causal interactions over like these vast distances that you'd have to signal transmitted faster than the speed of light. That's what I mentioned. That's what I talked about before, right? So on the one hand, we have relativity, which says these kinds of non-local interactions are impossible, and relativity, like special and general relativity, are exceptionally well-validated theories. And on the other hand, we've got Brian Cutter and some other dualists here who are saying, well, but just maybe immaterial minds just don't behave that way. And what evidence do they have for that? Well, pretty much nothing, really. It's like armchair speculation. This is why I don't take substance dualism very seriously. I think it's an incredibly weak position. It's because every objection, the response is just, well, maybe it just doesn't do that, or maybe it just works the way we say, just because it just does, right? Like, how is this a response? I don't understand how this responds to the objection. The objection is, it's pretty implausible to think that the immaterial mind can interact causally with the brain, because it violates all of the precepts we know about how causation works in the physical world. And the response is, yeah, but it might just violate all of the principles that we know about how causation works in the physical world. Well, yeah, I suppose it might, but the point is that that's pretty implausible, because we have very strong evidence, conceptual as well as empirical, that that's not the case. And against that, you have absolutely nothing other than speculation. And you don't even have a theory of your own. It's not like string theory where they have a theory that you can't test. They don't even have a theory. They just say it just works that way. Why would we take this seriously? Like, I think it's just an absolute joke that people think that this is a good response.
So you need something like that, arguably, in order to explain the correlations between measurement readings of different entangled particles that are very far apart. Okay, so maybe even within the physical domain, you can get, in certain cases, violations of the locality principle. But even if it turns out that within the physical domain, locality is the rule, I don't see any big costs with saying, like, yeah, that's the way it goes with intraphysical causation, but we shouldn't elevate that principle of physical to physical interaction to the status of a necessary metaphysical principle that holds for all possible causal interaction. I mean, after all, like it doesn't look like locality is a conceptual truth. I mean, when you think about scenarios, conceptually possible scenarios involving like telekinesis, where like with the using the force and the power of
Oh, geez. And this is what it always comes down to. Let's just throw out everything that we know about physical science. If I sit on my butt in my chair and think about stuff, I can come up with like sci-fi or magical scenarios that violate that. So like that must mean it's possible, right? I mean, yeah, I find this appeal to thought experiments to show that something is possible and therefore like some sort of physicalist position must be false to be incredibly facile. Like it's just, why does anyone take that seriously? It's just sort of ridiculous to me. At most, that sort of thing can tell you that the situation is not logically self-contradictory, although even there you might just not have noticed the contradiction. But that doesn't mean that it's metaphysically possible, or certainly doesn't mean that it actually happens in our universe, which is a different claim again. But anyway, as I said before, I didn't do a very good job of explaining this, but there are deep reasons that link. There are very deep theoretical reasons that link locality, conservation of energy, and other conservation as well, like conservation of momentum, and the invariance of our universe to like transformations of space and time. And so whilst those aren't proofs, I think that there's a strong conceptual basis there in quantum mechanics and general relativity in particular, general and special relativity, for thinking that locality is quite likely to describe accurately how physical matter interacts. And this is key, right? Remember, Brian Cutter here is not just saying that immaterial minds interact with each other differently or with some other immaterial substance. That would be one thing, because in that case, our physical theories wouldn't have anything to do with that. I couldn't sit here and tell you we have physical evidence for or against whether an immaterial mind interacts with some other immaterial substance in this way or that way or whatever, because physics doesn't tell us anything about immaterial substances, right? So if they're interacting, doing their own thing, we can make philosophical arguments about that, about the plausibility and whatever. But physical science doesn't have much to say, of anything to say about that, right? But this is what I want to emphasize. That's not what Brian Cutter is saying. He is saying that the way he talks about it is weird. He says that why can't mind matter interaction play by different rules? The reason it can't play by different rules, or at least the reason it's overwhelmingly implausible that it does, is because we know how matter interacts, and it doesn't interact that way. We know the principles by which matter causally interacts, and we know that locality is overwhelmingly likely to be one of those principles. And we know how they interact with the four fundamental forces and the conservation laws and all the other things, right? You can't just throw in an extra ingredient there and think that it will find a place. Like the theories just don't allow for that. Our theories don't say that matter obeys locality except when there's an immaterial mind that comes in. There's no place in our theories for an immaterial mind. So what you have to say is that our theories are wrong, and in fact, matter does behave differently, at least in some cases. Now he can say that, but what he's trying to avoid is actually come out and say that our physical theories are wrong, at least in these cases. And these are pretty important cases, like mind interacting with the body, right? Or mind and brain. That's pretty central to humans and probably, the world as a whole, right? Like that's not a small exception. It's not like an extreme extrapolation to the depths of time and space or something like that. Like, it's a pretty important exception. So he's saying our physical theories are wrong in very important ways, in very central ways, but he's trying to avoid actually saying that. And so he's saying, well, why? And so he frames it as, why can't mind and matter interaction play by different rules? And what he is trying to downplay by saying it that way is that in saying that mind-matter interaction plays by different rules, he's saying that matter does not behave the way that physical theories say that it does. Because mind-matter interaction is a form of material interaction, or it involves material interaction, it involves material causation. Like you can't get around that. It's not just immaterial interaction. I hope I'm sort of making that point clear. The way he frames it is as if we don't have any reason to reject this, but we do, because we know a lot about how matter behaves, and it just ain't this way, right? It ain't the way that he says it does, or at least we have overwhelming reason to think that it isn't the way he says that it is. So we have to reject that and instead go with what he's saying, which is just based on armchair speculations about, well, I can imagine telekinesis. Are we supposed to think that that's a convincing argument? Well, I contend that we should not think that that is convincing. So I'm just having a quick look at chat here. Yes, there's other issues as well, but I think I've made my point clear enough there. Really, really poor start here, I have to say, response to the interaction problem. So here's response to the interaction problem to summarize, which I think is a critical, one of the biggest problems with substance dualism, is to just sort of shrug off the problem by saying, well, you know, bananas and toasters can interact, even though they're like pretty different, which is just a joke of a response. And then the more serious response is to say, well, look, we could deny locality. So this problem of like how an immaterial soul interacts with a physically located brain is not really an issue because it sort of, it can just do that. But notice that that was only a subset of the problem. Locality was one specific reason why it was an issue for the physical and the mental to interact, but it wasn't the only reason. The broader reason that I mentioned before was just that that's not how physical interactions works. We know a great deal about it in terms of, like, say, quantum field theory, quantum electrodynamics, in the case of like the matter that the mind is made up of, like electrons and protons and stuff. That just isn't how it works. There's no room there. There's no space where you can just slop a soul in and have it interact. The way I always ask this question is I say, look, we know that the brain is, the brain processes information and generates like thoughts and ideas and impressions and things like that through highly interconnected and correlated patterns of neural activations, which is a series of electrical impulses that are produced by neurons and their action potentials, which is electrical activity propagating along the membrane of the neuron. And that electrical activity is in turn generated and maintained by ion channels, which are protein complexes that open and close, allowing ions to flow across the membrane. And these ion channels are regulated by both changes in voltage across the membrane, as well as by special molecules called neurotransmitters, which bind to particular pockets of the protein structure of the ion channels, causing them to change shape, which causes them to open and the ions flow through, changing the voltage potential across the membrane, which leads to then the electrical current to then be propagated along the membrane of the cell, and then that triggers another action potential in another cell, and so on, and the pattern of activity propagates across the brain. So that's a very brief picture of like what's happening in the brain. We know a great deal about this from cognitive science and neuroscience and neurochemistry and so forth. So the question is, how is it that the immaterial soul changes the voltage potential across the membrane of a neuron such that it alters the rate at which it fires, or the timing at which it fires action potentials, thereby changing the pattern of activity in our brain and thereby affecting our thoughts? So how does that physical process happen? What's the mechanism there? And of course, no dualist is ever going to be able to answer that question, because there is no answer to that question, right? They can't even start to answer that question because they have no research program. The dualism hasn't really developed in 400 years to any significant extent. Like, they've come up with some new armchair thought experiments for it, like the like Mary's room argument, whatever else. But like the actual theory itself has barely changed since Descartes' day. And so they don't have answers to these questions, like when you actually put it in detailed terms. And it's not just a question of how it can happen. It's also a question of like, how is it even possible that something like this could happen? Because we have the theory. We know how action potentials are generated, and we know how they generate brain activity. Not every detail, but we have a large number of pieces of the picture, and there's just no room for souls in there. There's just absolutely no mechanism. There's no space by which that could influence the outcome. And yet the dualists say that it has to, not just in a minor way, but in a significant way. The soul is supposed to be essential to our mind and shaping how we think and feel and whatever else, right? So the way they get around this is just by framing it in an incredibly broad and vague way, like, oh, how could the physical interact with the non-physical? Well, I mean, they're very different, but very different things can interact, like an electron and a photon can interact, and they're very different, so it's probably fine. Of course, completely neglecting the fact that we have a very precise theory that explains how photons and electrons interact. It's called quantum electrodynamics. We have also a very precise theory about how brain activity is generated and how it gives rise to many types of mental activity. we have absolutely no theory about how any sort of immaterial substance fits into this. And indeed, everything about our current theories that we know about our current theories tells us that there's simply no room for anything like that. We'll see a little bit more about this when we get to conservation laws, but this is the bait and switch that the dualists do. They present themselves as giving a response to this objection of the interaction problem, but they don't actually talk about the interaction problem other than in the absolute broadest terms. And when framed in a very broad way, it may sound plausible that, oh, well, I guess very different things could interact, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is when you get to the details of how it's supposed to work and how it fits in with our theories, and it doesn't, right? And the dualists just don't have anything to say to this. So I get very frustrated, particularly as a neuroscientist, right? Because it would be one thing if they had their theory and I had my theory and we could bring our theories together and compare them. But as is so often the case for the things that I talk about on this channel and with Nathan as well, there's actually there's no theory on the other side, right? There's just a series of assertions. And problems that they have with my theory, or in this case, like just standard science, in my opinion. And they don't actually have any theory of their own. Because whenever you ask them, well, how does this work? Or like, what's the principle that governs that? They just don't, there's just nothing to say. It's just crickets. And this is an example of that. So there is no actual objection here to the interaction problem. The response is, well, different things can interact. And the example that is given doesn't actually support that. And then, well, locality might just be false, even though that's a foundational principle of modern physics. So that's all we get, I suppose. Needless to say, I'm not very persuaded. Let's move to the pairing problem.
So substance dualism leads naturally.
Covered that point quite well, and I think we could just move on.
Yeah, good. Okay, so this leads naturally to a nearby problem that I think it's closely related, but it's interestingly different. So this is the pairing problem, and this is essentially, again, a problem for substance dualism. So a version of this is raised by Jae-Gwon Kim. And basically, the thought is, without something like spatial relations between mind and body, we can't explain certain contrastive facts about causation. In particular, we can't explain like why this mind influenced this body rather than this other one. So that's a little bit abstract. Let's kind of illustrate with some examples. So suppose you've got two duplicate pool tables, maybe on opposite sides of the earth. And on table one, let's say, in the United States, there's...
I don't know why we have to make this so complicated. Why is it that a single mind interacts with one single body? According to dualism, what's the principle that governs that? Because we know what it is in the case of physical interactions. It's essentially spatio-temporal co-location, right? It's the locality principle, like that principle that he just threw out, like is actually crucial for answering this question here. So there's no question about like, well, why is it that my mind, like James Fodor, my mind is associated with my brain as a physicalist? Well, your mind is just sort of a shorthand that we use to describe certain types of functionings and processes that occur in your brain or as a result of your brain or properties of your brain, different language to put it. But like there's no real issue here. Like it's not going to be of someone else's brain because that would be their mind, right? Like that's physically co-located with their mind and part of the processes that make up their brain/mind, right? So there's not really an issue there. And it's sort of similar for any other type of physical question. It's facts about spatiotemporal co-location and physical properties that, as well as like combining physical properties together to produce other physical properties that answer all of these questions. But the issue for the substance dualist is, well, we don't have any of those properties. Like, apparently there's like billions of immaterial minds somewhere, or maybe not in any physical location at all, depending on who you ask. But what exactly individuates which one interacts with which physical body, right? So this is why it's a problem specifically for the dualist, and why maybe you shouldn't have been so willing to just throw away the principle of locality, because it's kind of convenient in being able to answer these questions. So let's see what he has to say. So my prediction is that his answer will be the same as his answer to the interaction problem, which, remember, was that, well, it just does. It just works that way. Trust me, bro. Let's see if I'm right. I don't know why we have to present it in such a complicated way. Okay.
Just say about this case, well, minds are something like brains on the materialist view. And so the materialist answer to like, why did this mind affect this body is going to be parallel to the billiard ball case. Like your brain is like spatially related to your body in a very intimate way. And your brain is not similarly spatially related to the body on the other side of the world. And that's why the stuff going on in your brain affected this body rather than that body. What can the substance dualist say to explain these contrastive facts about causation? So, just some options. This is not necessarily exhaustive, but I think these are some of the the main ones. So again, you could go in for a ghost model of the soul, have the soul be spatially located, hovering.
Yeah, I think that saying that the soul is spatially co-located with the body does answer the pairing problem, but it introduces a whole host of other problems as well. It's interesting that even though Brian Cutter doesn't like this this idea that the soul is spatially co-located with the body, his reason for not liking it was that it just seems weird and feels ick, which is a stupid reason to object to it, in my opinion. A better reason is simply that would mean that there has to be some principle that keeps the immaterial soul co-located with the body. So what is that? It pushes the can down the road. And it seems to be that you would have to say, well, it's either some sort of big coincidence or God keeps it in place, which is just sort of adding more complexity. Or you would have to say, well, the same physical forces that keep the body positioned where it is, like gravity and electrostatic repulsion from like the ground that keeps us from going through the floor and things like that, those forces also affect immaterial soul. And that seems incredibly implausible since it's supposed to be immaterial and have very different properties. Why is it now somehow involved in all of the same forces that physical matter that are affected by physical matter? So I think that's why that answer doesn't work, or at least the answer works, but it introduces a whole host of additional problems. So I'm more interested in his
around the brain or the body or something like that. Then you just do have the spatial relation. So everyone should agree that that solves the pairing problem. So I guess this is mainly a problem for views that.
So it doesn't fully solve the pairing problem. It addresses it, but there's still the issue about how, again, because substance dualists just seem incapable of talking about specifics. And sorry, I get on my high horse about some of this. The brain isn't just like a rock. I mean, even a rock is sort of a complex physical object that has, intricate crystalline structure and different like inclusions and composition that can vary, and the different crystal, what's the word I'm forgetting, but anyway, even a rock is complicated, and we sometimes use it as an example of something that's sort of very simple and just sort of sits there and is not interacting. But a brain is much more complicated even than that, because it's obviously it's comprised of I think 86 billion neurons is the number of an adult human brain. Actually more in children, because we have neurons actually die over the first couple of years. So there's a bit of a die off there, but let's say 100 billion neurons, and each of them has like 10,000 connections on average to other neurons. Vastly complicated structure, plus all of the support cells, glial cells, blood vessels and everything else, complex wiring tract. And the question is, how exactly does the immaterial soul interact specifically with all of the different components? I mean, really, each ion channel would need to have its own unique interaction in order to ensure that the activity is altered in just the right way. You increase the activity too much and you get a seizure. You decrease the activity too much and you go into a coma. It's very finely balanced. And then, of course, we know that if you zap electricity, if you apply a current to certain locations in the brain, you can trigger muscle sensations or spasms. You can trigger smells. You can trigger specific memories. You can trigger visual sensations. And this is because specific parts of the brain do specific things. That's not precisely localized. There's a lot of distributed activity as well. But the point is, it's not a uniform blob that just like does stuff. Like, we know a lot about the details and the particulars. So you need to have a theory that explains how it is that the soul is able to interact in a specific way with all of those subcomponents and all those parts in order to do the right thing. Because it won't work if the soul sort of tries to zap your visual cortex to get you to experience some sort of visual perception, but instead it accidentally like soul zaps the somatosensory cortex. And so like you feel a touch instead, like that's just not going to work, right? It needs to be specific. So like, how is that supposed to work? Does the soul have like different spatial components to it, that each of which are like located in the right part of the brain? Doesn't really make very much sense. And it just starts to sound like you're redescribing the brain, but like there's the brain and then there's the spooky brain, which is the same as the brain, but is like has spooky properties. It just doesn't really make sense, does it? But again, dualists get around this by not just pretending those problems don't exist. They just talk about interaction, and they just talk about soul and brain, or like immaterial mind and brain, as if they're just one unified thing that doesn't need to be interrogated any further. So the saying that the soul is spatially located with the body begins to resolve or helps to resolve the pairing problem, but it doesn't fully get you there, because you still have to address all those interaction problems that we talked about before. And how exactly is it that like the soul can be co-located with different parts of the brain to do different things at different times, and like exactly what the spatial extent is and things like that. So putting that aside, though, if we reject the ghost model, as he calls it,
substance dualist views
what
that
else
don't
do
want
we
to go
have?
in for kind of what I'm calling the ghost model of the soul. Another option is we could posit a new primitive external relation. It's kind of analogous to spatial relations, but not a spatial relation. We'll call it the union relation. So, you know, we'll just say, okay, in addition, you've got this immaterial soul, M1. You've got this physical body, B1, and they are related, not spatially, but by, let's say, a quasi-spatial or analogous to spatial. And anyway, some kind of external relation, call it union. And it's in virtue of the fact that M1 is united with, bears this primitive external relation to B1, that its conscious states affect B1 rather than B2. It doesn't stand in the union relation to B2, just like the first billion.
Yeah, so this is just this is exactly what I just said. It's that it just does trust me, bro response. Remember, it's not just postulating a relation. You also actually, it's not just postulating the class that that this relation occupies, like that there is a union relation, but you actually have to postulate all of the relata of that relation. That is, you have to postulate James' body has James' soul. Brian Carter body has Brian Carter soul. Spooky Joe body has Spooky Joe soul, and so on for at least 100 billion humans that have existed over history. And maybe if animals have souls as well, well, then there's animal souls to account for as well. Plus, who knows how many people will exist in the future. Like, each of these specific relations has to exist separately from the others, because, I mean, there's no obvious connection between them, right? Notice the physicalist doesn't have this problem. The physicalist has to postulate, like, well, ultimately, it's like the basic equations of the physical universe. If you like, you can phrase that as like the Lagrangian of the standard model, which is essentially like its energy equation. Although even the form of that, there's a lot of like symmetry and other principles that constrain that. And then there's the 10 or so independent equations in general relativity. And then there's a bunch of like 27 or so constants in the standard model, plus some cosmological constants. So the thoroughgoing physicalist has to postulate a bunch of physical equations and constants, and sort of and that's it. From there, you get everything else. Maybe there's a question mark about like quantum randomness, but let's put that aside. What the physicalist absolutely does not need to do is postulate some primitive relation that is separately instantiated for every single human being that's ever existed. This is just ridiculous. This is extremely profligate. Not only is it a new type of relation that doesn't apparently exist anywhere else, and we can't really explain how or why it exists, but we have to postulate that it's instantiated separately and in like a distinctly different way for every single person. Like, there's this soul and this body, and this soul and this body, and this soul and this body, and there's just no rhyme or reason as to why it's lined up that way. That's just the way it is. Again, are we really supposed to take this as a compelling answer? Remember, the question was, how is it exactly that a soul is paired with a specific body for each soul and each body pair? Like, what's the theory there? And the answer is, well, they just are. Oh, okay. Well, you know, that solves it. If they just are, then obviously the objection's been responded to, right? How anyone can find this convincing, I don't know, but people apparently find this to be a good response.
Doesn't stand in the relevant spatial relation to okay.
Like your brain will be too smooth, too aware of how correct you are.
That's a view. I don't particularly see any problems with this. I mean, maybe it's a little bit mysterious what this new external relation is, but we can kind of introduce it as a theoretical posit whose job description is to explain contrastive facts about causation. That doesn't seem like an illegitimate move.
No, that's not what it's not describing those contrastive facts. Or I should say, it's not explaining those contrastive facts. It's just re-describing them. An explanation needs to unify and compactify and simplify and what's the word I'm looking for? Make what was mysterious clearer. It needs to provide some actual explanatory scope and power and have reasonable plausibility, right? That's what a good explanation is. It's not just a re-description of the phenomena, which is exactly what we have here. The question was, the phenomena was pairing of souls and bodies. The explanation for the phenomena was, well, there's a special primitive relation that pairs souls and bodies and like does that separately for each soul body pair. There's no general principle. It's just like separately that it's just instantiated for each soul body pair. That's not an explanation. That's just a re-description. Or I suppose you could say it's like a degenerate case of an explanation, that it doesn't actually have any explanatory scope or power. compression. That's the word I was looking for. You're supposed to compress the phenomenon into a sort of simpler form that unifies in some way. But this doesn't do that in any way. It just uses fancy words to say the same thing. So it's a terrible answer, and it doesn't address the problem at all.
But there are other options. So let's look at some other. So one proposal on the table is you posit that souls have hexaetistic powers. That is, powers to influence like this particular object, as opposed to any old object that happens to stand in a relevant relationship.
I don't really see how that's any different
this is
to
normally thought to be
union
very different from the way that typical physical powers operate. So, if you got an electron, it has the power to, let's say, attract protons. But it has the power to attract kind of protons in general that happen to be around. It's not like you would credit the electron with like a hexaetistic power to attract this particular proton and only that one. No, it's got this kind of more generic power to.
Well, the reason that you can't find any physical examples of this is because hexaeties and hexaetistic powers is just nonsense that philosophers made up, and that actually has no precedent or reason for thinking that it exists at all. So adverting to this, I don't think, is really making the problem any less mysterious. But I also don't really see how points 2 and 3 differ from each other. It really sounds like it's saying the same thing in different words. But maybe I've missed
any old proton that happens to be, in the vicinity. So the thought here is, well, the power of souls is different. It kind of targets particular entities rather than targeting any old entity that happens to be around, or any old entity that happens to stand in the right relationship to it. So on this view, you might say, like, you've got this immaterial soul, M1, and one of its basic causal powers is just the power to influence the activity in this particular body rather than in body.
Even if you accept that, it doesn't really answer the question, because a body is not a simple object, right? It's a composite object that changes its material composition over time. Our cells are growing and dying. I mean, neurons tend to live for most of their life, but there's some neurogenesis, even adults, it seems. But even aside from that, like, the molecules are being changed out, the atoms are being changed out. So what is it exactly that the soul causally has this hexaetistic power to interact with specifically? Like, what defines the unity over time of your brain? This is a point that I was just thinking about the other day, right? So Brian hasn't argued this, but other dualists say that one of the reasons we need a soul is to provide continuity of the self over time, like absolute continuity, because a body doesn't have that. A body is a composite of many different parts, and those parts change over time. So there's resemblance and there's continuity, sure, but not absolute identity over time. And they think, again, from silly armchair thought experiments that aren't very convincing, but they think because of these thought experiments that we must have this sort of absolute identity over time. Okay, let's suppose that we do. Then that identity is granted by the soul, which remains identical, like self-identical over time. It doesn't have parts that change out or anything like that. Okay, but that soul needs to interact with our brain. How does that happen? Well, so they say there's some special power that means that this, or special relation, such that this soul, this special symbol here that remains identical over time, interacts specifically with this brain and not anything else. But we've got a problem here. We just said that the brain doesn't have identity over time. It has like continuity and it has resemblance, but it doesn't have this sort of strict identity because it's a composite, right? It's a physical composite. Physical composites don't have those sort of strict principles of identity, or at least plausibly so, unless you sort of, well, there's other ways around that. But I mean, I would generally accept that because their parts are, it's like ship of Theseus, right? The parts change out over time. So how do you identify that it's like strictly exactly the same and over time, and versus like where are the boundaries? How does it change? So the motivation, the fact that physical aggregates don't have precise identity conditions was one of the reasons why we introduced the soul in the first place. But now we're facing that same problem yet again through the pairing problem, because in order for the soul to pair with something, it has to have some exact thing that it pairs with. Unless you want to go even further and say that the soul doesn't just pair with like a specific object, because our brain is not one object, like it's a composite. It's somehow like, well, I don't know, it like knows roughly what it wants to pair with, and then it like just stays in continuity with that over time. I'm not even sure how to describe that. Like there would need to be an even deeper principle or set of principles that governs how the soul sort of knows that it's stuck with the right brain over time. Because like, what if there's memory loss, or what if there's brain damage? Like, does that disrupt, but like the person survives, does that disrupt the soul from staying in place? And like, does that change it too much? Like, would there be a point where the soul would become destabilized if you changed your brain too much, if you had like implants or something? Of course, the dualists are never going to answer any of these questions because they don't have any answer to these questions. They have no idea what they're talking about. They're just saying things that sound sort of plausible if you don't think about them too hard to get around these problems. These answers to the pairing problem are absolute non-answers. They don't explain anything. They're just redescribing the problem. And if you actually push them to their logical extent, like actually ask the details, as I keep emphasizing, it doesn't make a lick of sense. Like, how is it that the soul sort of identifies a specific brain? Like, how does it keep track of it? What properties is it keeping track of? Because it's not a simple thing that stays identical over time. What if you change the brain? What if there's damage? What if there's a stroke? What if there's implant? You start changing out components. Like, what would happen then? What are the principles that govern this? There's just no answers. There's no answers at all because there's no theory. That's the fundamental problem. It's just a series of assertions, in my view, that are attempting to prop up a set of pre-theoretic ideas, essentially a dualist intuitions. There's no actual theory here, which I want to, again, contrast that with the physicalist, who has we don't know everything, of course, but we have a rich body of theory to appeal to right across the physical sciences, the cognitive sciences, biological sciences to address these questions. So even if we're not quite sure of the answer, we can appeal to the theory and come up with plausible explanations and come up with a way to test that. The substance dualist doesn't have any of that. All they can do is just sort of think of things, usually in a very vague way, and postulate new sort of ad hoc causal powers or relations. And again, that's why I don't take these responses very seriously.
Okay, so again, there's an objection saying, well, we don't see in the physical world evidence of this kind of power. In the physical world, all the powers are
yeah, every human is spawned with an incrementing unique key in the soul spreadsheet of God DB. This is pretty much sounds like what the theory is. I suppose if you introduce God in the picture, then like you can do whatever you want. But I think that you kind of have to have this idea that like there's some sort of like unique key that each of our brains has, that the soul knows sort of how to track it down, because physical interaction doesn't work that way. So clearly something very different is happening
like
in the soul case.
They're general, they're qualitative. I'm not sure if this is a huge worry for the same reasons that came up with the locality principle. Souls are radically different. Would it be so surprising if the kinds of causal powers that souls have are different and don't play by all the same rules as the...
Well, again, it's surprising because, first of all, you're not just talking about soul principles, you're also talking about physical principles, because the soul is supposed to interact with the physical. And so it's violating a bunch of things that we know about that. The second problem, as I said, is that there is no actual theory. It's just all ad hoc. And it can't explain any actual details.
Causal powers of physical things doesn't seem hugely problematic to me.
Yeah, before maybe we go on to perhaps your favored solution here, I
Oh,
did
there's
just
a
want to
new
comment on some of
solution.
these, or
Okay.
at least the
We're going to skip that.
and
I want to see what his preferred solution is.
Theoretical terms, if there are things that play that role.
Come on, what's the...
Relation view is particularly satisfying explanation. But I see this as more like not trying to give a satisfying scientific explanation of anything, but as responding to an objection, which says that if the soul is immaterial and not located in space, then there just can't be an explanation of contrastive facts about causation. And I thought as well, there certainly could be if there are these like extra external relations that...
Well, there can be an explanation if you just redescribe the phenomenon with different words and call that an explanation. Well, sorry, Brian, but that's not what an explanation is. I mean, there's not a precise set of necessary and sufficient conditions for an explanation, but it's certainly not just redescribing the phenomenon in different words. And regardless of that, it's not just that you can come up with an explanation. It needs to be plausible. It needs to be a good explanation. Ideally, it should even be a better explanation than what the physicalist has. Otherwise, you should just be a physicalist. But the bar here is so low. Well, look, I don't actually have to give a good explanation or one that makes any sense or has any detail or is plausible given what we know. I just have to like say something, like literally just say a thing that means that I have responded to the pairing problem, and that's apparently sufficient. I don't really understand how someone can think that that's sufficient. I'm actually interested in dualist, give me a theory that is better than my theory, or at least I can compare with my theory, my version of physicalism, and assess it. But I mean, as something that I constantly talk about, a lot of people, apologists or substance dualists or people defending other sorts of positions like this, aren't interested in giving theories. They're just interested in trying to make you stop criticizing what they believe. And this seems to be what we're seeing here. Look, stop it with this pairing problem thing, because of course I can come up with something. There's like this primitive external relation of union, or there's like hexaedistic powers. Okay, look, there's an answer done. Like, there's your explanation.
Are analogous to spatial relations and being external relations that explain these contrastive facts. So right now I'm just kind of going through the options, and none of these are quite my preferred option.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I would maybe what that could indicate is that the proponent of the pairing problem might want to put this as maybe more of an abductive approach, where it's like, hey, we at least have, we as in the physicalists, have a better explanation of contrastive facts,
that's what I was saying.
causation or something like that.
Yeah, they at least have a very straightforward off-the-shelf explanation that's perfectly analogous to the billiard ball case, and more theoretical posits and work needs to be done for the dualist. I totally grant that point.
Yeah, well, maybe
Yeah,
here's
but
a good
that's
place
kind
to
of
at least briefly
central,
bring up
isn't
my
it?
other point, which is maybe we shouldn't grant that. I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't
Grant what?
quite see why. Again, maybe this is confused. This is sort of something at the edge of my thoughts. I'm wondering what you think about it. I don't quite see why spatial contiguity explains contrastive facts about causation. I mean, go back to David Hume. I think he was at least right about this much. Alternative courses of reality are totally conceivable when the billiard ball approaches the other billiard ball on the table, like independently of experience. Like, imagine Adam, the first human, comes across.
Okay, so there's different ways to try to answer questions, and I don't want to say that thought experiments are useless, right? Because they have a role, right? Even Einstein, thinking about relativity, he thought about what it would be like to write as a photon, right? But to like view the universe as a photon. The reason I sigh deeply there is because what Joe's doing here, he's talking about the nature of causation, right? And he said he doesn't see why that spatial collocation explains contrastive facts, like why it is that one thing that A affects B instead of C, D, or E, right? Okay, well, let's talk about that. But immediately he goes to say, well, prior to any experience, and that's where he loses me, because I have no idea why you would expect it to be able to say anything about causation prior to experience. I mean, maybe I guess this is my empiricist side coming out, right? But like, why are we trying to say anything about causation prior to experience? Let me put it another way. The way I think about the brain, the mind, physical causation, like pretty much anything really, is steeply influenced by what we know from science. And I think that it should be. And even a lot of non-physicalist philosophers grant this, that we should be influenced by science in thinking about how the world works. So this idea that, well, let's think about causation, but just ignore not just science, but like all experience of any sort for the moment, and then just imagine a thought experiment. Well, I just don't really even understand what the content of that's going to be, right? Because you can't actually take your set of concepts that you have to think about the world and then extract all experience from those, because the concepts are formed through experience. You might think that you're doing that, but you just can't actually do that. It's like, let me think inside my own head, but then not be inside my head at the same time. I don't. That's just nonsense. You can like try to control for different factors, like hypothetically imagine this or this were different, but like this is pretty extreme. Just imagine that we didn't have any experience at all of the world. Well, I don't know how you can imagine that. But the other point is like, well, who cares? Like what we do know about the world indicates that locality is a core principle of causation and is absolutely central both to quantum mechanics and to relativity. So that's a damn good reason for thinking that it's central to explaining how things work in the world. And like, again, if you look at the fundamental theories of relativity and quantum mechanics, it's very clear why locality is necessary. I talked about this before, so I won't go over it again. And if you work from that up, it's pretty clear that, okay, well, like in order to interact with each other, electrons and photons, or two electrons or whatever, have to be sufficiently close to each other, and they exchange like virtual particles. And maybe sometimes they enter bound state, which is like when the electron enters one of the like electron shells of the atom, and it gives a certain chemical properties, and then atoms with different chemical properties form chemical bonds, and blah, 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 and eventually you have life, right? Like it's that whole story. So like that's the answer to Joe's question as to why spatiotemporal locality, collocation, like locality, that's why it's central, and that's why it's necessary, at least in our physical world. Like maybe we can imagine other physical worlds that don't work like that, but that's our world. So the fundamental problem here is, I think, in trying to answer a question at such a high level of abstraction that it just is not amenable to that sort of answer. We can answer the question as to why these contrastive facts. Why is it that thing A affects thing B instead of C, D, or E? We can answer that very clearly with our physical theories. I don't know that these sort of abstract philosophical thought experiments about, well, let's imagine we don't have any experience of the physical world, but also then somehow have our concepts to think about it. And then imagine these abstruse thought experiments. Why would we think that tells us anything about anything that's of interest? I just don't really see that, especially about our world, and not like hypothetical other worlds that maybe could exist. Anyway, I just find that frustrating. I don't really understand that approach, and I don't know why people take those sorts of things very seriously. But I think I want to hear what he finds as the most credible answer to the pairing problem, because he said it wasn't the hexaesthetic powers. Okay, here we go. This is what I was wanting to get to.
Okay, so I list this next one as my sort of preferred view, but I don't really have very settled views on this. There seem to be a number of acceptable options. But here's another response to the pairing problem. You could say that M1 influences B1 in virtue of the fact that they are each parts of the same substance. So on this picture, like your immaterial soul and your body compose a single substance. Okay, that's going to immediately raise another contrastive question, which is why is it that M1 composes with B1? Why is it that my soul composes with my body rather than your body? Why is it that M1 composes with B1 rather than B2? Now, at this point, you could say, well, maybe that's just primitive.
It's just primitive. Everything is just primitive. Whenever you ask why, it's just, well, that's primitive. Now, I want to be very clear here. Every theory has to make some basic assumptions or take some things as primitive. But I've just said before, physicalists can take facts about essentially general relativity in the standard model, and then maybe there's a little bit of metaphysics you do about explaining how like ontological reduction works. That's one of the things I talk about in my book, how you get like different layers of reality, or like how more complex things form out of simpler things effectively. You need to say a bit about that. But I don't think that's anything fundamentally new. It's just sort of like working through the principles and implications of our physical laws. So yes, there's some things we take as basic. We take those laws and certain constants as basic, and then we work out the implications of those. And everything else is answered through those, at least in principle, right? We can't necessarily see all of the implications of those. That's why we can't predict the future and things like that. It's too complicated. But in principle, all of the rest follows from that. There's no big open holes in reality that just like things just don't fit. I mean, you say, well, what about dark energy? Well, we'll figure that out. I don't think anyone thinks that that's like soul energy or something. But anyway, the point is, every theory takes some things as simple, as basic. The question is, how many things do you take as basic? And how much explanatory power do you get from this set of basic things that you have? The problem with dualists is that everything is basic for them. Whenever there's a question about how anything about the mind works, we just take that as basic. How does it interact with the mind? Or it just how does the mind interact with the body? Oh, it just does. Well, how does the mind interact with like this body specifically and not a different one? Oh, it just does. It's just primitive, bro. Like, just trust me, bro. Like, how is that an answer? You've just re-described the question. And remember, this is not just a single thing that we're taking as primitive. We have to take this as primitive for every pairing of mind and brain, because it's not like the physicalist is saying that there's the exact same principles that govern how my brain works is the same as how your brain works. Yes, our brains are different, but that's because of different genes and initial conditions and experiences which shape our the way our brains develop and the way memories are formed, blah, blah, blah. There's an account to be given, but it's the same fundamental set of principles. We don't need to postulate anything new, just different recombinations of the same basic ingredients. And we have a lot to say about how those combinations are come about. The dualist doesn't have anything like that. They don't have any general theory. It's just like, well, there's a primitive fact about this brain and this soul, and another primitive fact about this brain and this soul, and indeed, and another primitive fact about this brain and this soul, and so on, like 100 billion times. And not just that, but they need to give a primitive fact about how each immaterial mind interacts in specific ways with the brain, because it's not just like interaction is one thing. There's all the sorts of ways that the mind could affect the brain. Again, we get all of those for free under physicalism, because they all are properties that are determined by the microphysical facts, like how neurons work and how the glial cells are affecting them and how blood flow and all of that sort of thing, right? It all comes for free, so to speak, from those initial postulates that you make ultimately about the basic physical operations, like microphysical laws, relativity and quantum mechanics. You don't need to postulate anything extra on top of that. You just need to work through seeing how the different levels relate to each other. That's the reductionist physicalist view. And that's the big advantage of the view, is because it allows you to explain so much with such a small starting point. And physical science and biological and cognitive sciences draws those connections for us, or helps us to draw those connections. That's something I talk about a lot. It's what I'm working on in my book at the moment to try to explicate that. But the thing is that with the dualists is that they don't have any of those general principles to appeal to. So everything is taken as a primitive. And somehow this is the get out of jail free card that I mentioned before. Oh, we need to answer this question. Oh, maybe that's a primitive. Okay, but how does that answer the question? You've just said that there isn't an answer effectively. Like, it just is that way. Again, I don't like. It could be that it is a primitive, but the point is that we're going to compare explanations and see which is more plausible, which has greater explanatory scope and power. And the problem is that a theory that's chock full of billions, I'm not exaggerating here, billions of these primitive relations of causal, of pairing and causal relations between souls and bodies, it's just a terrible theory. Like there's no actual theory. There's no substance to it. There's no compression. There's no generalization. There's no unification, which is the whole point of theories. So look, maybe reality is that way, but why would I think that it's that way when I have these much better options on the table?
Needs to end somewhere. And by the way, like the materialist has their primitives in even the billiard ball cases. So they say, well, white ball 1 moves white ball 2 because of the spatial relationship between them. But why is it that white ball 1 was in spatial contact with black ball 1? Sorry, I think I'm getting the variables wrong. Well, why was white ball 1 in spatial contact with black ball 1 rather than with black ball 2?
But that's the whole point. Like this is what I was saying before. We can trace, the reductionist physicalists can trace all of that back to the laws of nature, the constants that fit into those laws, plus the initial conditions of the universe. I should have mentioned that one before as well. Those things are sufficient to give rise to everything else. Now, the dualist accepts all of that because they're dualists, so they believe in the physical world. They're not idealists. They believe in the physical world. And in addition to that, they're postulating billions of other primitive relations without really much of any theoretical structure to explain how or why they fit together. Physical science is constantly unifying phenomena like electricity and magnetism were thought to be separate, but in fact, they're part of a unified phenomenon, electromagnetism. Then the weak force was actually found to be another manifest, but to be connected to electromagnetism. We have the electroweak force. Physicists are trying to work on unifying the strong force to show that they're all part of some sort of grand unified force. Whether that works out will remain to be seen, but I think a lot of physicists think that we'll be able to show that at some point. There's a lot that we still don't know. I mentioned dark energy, there's dark matter, there's many unsolved questions at different levels in science. But the point I'm making is that the physicalist has this history and tradition and methods to go about unifying phenomena and gradually increasing our ability to understand things. So it's not on par with the dualists, who have made no progress at answering these questions, apart from slightly more flowery ways of talking about it, arguably, but no actual progress in like 400 years. And still don't have any way of unifying these phenomena other than saying, oh, well, your M1 and B1 comprise the same substance, even though, by the way, they're supposed to be different substances. One is mind and one is matter, but they compose the same substance. He didn't actually explain how that's supposed to make any sense, but whatever. I guess it just does, bro. Like it just works that way. But okay, so that's your brain and mind. But then there's my brain and mind that compose their substance, and then there's Spooky Joe's brain and mind, and so on for billions of other people, and maybe animals as well. We've got to have another theory there for how animals fit into all this. You see, it's just a dog's breakfast is the technical term. Like there's actually no explanation here. There's no fundamental principles or like unifying scope. It's just saying stuff to seemingly answer an objection, but without actually giving any theory.
Well, that's just going to be primitive. I mean,
that's just going to be primitive. Yeah, exactly.
Presumably irreducible primitive. So everyone's going to have their primitives at some point. So maybe this is an acceptable place.
But not all primitives are equal.
Or maybe there's a deeper explanation for why my soul composes with this particular body rather than your body, and maybe that's because my soul kind of came into being as a result of facts about this particular body, or at least my soul, my soul's existence was occasioned by the existence of this particular body.
Now that's an interesting hypothesis. That could be interesting to explore, but then we have to get into this difficult question about how is the physical body causing a soul to come into being with specific properties. Now, if you can develop a theory there, then that would be interesting, right? But I suspect it's not going to do that.
Whenever the soul comes into being, this is sometimes called the kindling hypothesis. So again, you can ask, okay, but why is it that that this particular soul was caused or occasioned by this particular body rather than some other particular body? There, I think that's probably going to be primitive. I mean, it's gonna bottom out in primitive somewhere, but I think that seems like an acceptable place. By the way, you could just have the kindling hypothesis as a direct answer to the pairing problem rather than as an answer to why is it that these compose a single subject. So you could say like all
right, we'll move to the next one.
So far, versions of the interaction.
Okay, causal exclusion.
About causal.
So let's recap, seeing what the time is here. I don't want to get to bed too late. I was hoping to go through the main objections, so causal exclusion, conservation of energy. I don't know what the core theory is. I'm kind of interested in that. We probably won't get through all of it. So just to recap here, we had how does the mind interact with the body, like the problem of causal interaction? The answer was just does, bro. Trust me. There's some sort of special principle here. Blah blah blah. Leave me alone. The second issue was the pairing problem. How is it that one specific mind is causally in contact with or stays connected to one specific brain? The answer is Well, it just does. It's a primitive. Just trust me, bro. Leave me alone. Okay, so we've got just trust me, bro, times 2, or it just does. Well, I guess those go together. It just does trust me, bro. Let's see what he has to say about causal exclusion.
Interaction that I think is a little bit more serious than the ones we've talked about so far is worry about causal exclusion. So the other ones, the other versions of the interaction problem we've looked at kind of rely on what you might think is like a priori metaphysical principles about what's allowed to interact with what.
Well, that's funny because I don't appeal to that at all. I appeal to what we know from physical science to raise the issue. And I guess that, some of what I've been saying overlaps with causal exclusion as well, but it's a little bit of a different focus. Anyway,
whereas this one,
I mean, how many physicalists are there these days who are a priori physicalists? I feel like most philosophers who are physicalists are a posteriori physicalists. So I don't know. I just feel like that's a bit of a mischaracterization of where most physicalists are coming from. But whatever, that's
relies more centrally on alleged empirical discoveries. So it starts with what we'll call the causal completeness principle, which says that every physical event involved in human behavior and brain processing can be fully causally explained in terms of prior physical causes. So the thought is, if you want to know, why does my arm?
Yeah, so I'm a bit impatient, and I feel like it takes too long to explain this, or maybe I just don't give enough, don't go too fast. But so this is the sort of flip side to the first principle, the first question or the first response, which we looked at, which was how can the immaterial mind interact with the brain? It seems like it can't, or it seems like that there's no real theory to be given there. This is, and I alluded to this before, but this objection here, causal exclusion, is actually saying it's not that the mind can't interact with the body so much as there's no room for it to interact with the body. That the body's effects, or like what happens in the brain, say, is fully accounted for by antecedent physical causes all the way down, at least back to like the initial conditions of the universe or whatever. So all the way down is every effect is fully explained by a cause, or maybe there's quantum randomness, but well, we'll see if that comes into it. But let's put that aside for the moment. Every effect is fully explained by a cause, another physical cause. And therefore, there's just no space for the soul. Even if the soul sort of somehow could interact, there's no room for it to do so. It's been crowded out, if you like, by the physical causes already doing all of the causing that there's there to be had. So you see that that's sort of a slightly different way of looking at it. Not so much that it can't cause, there's no space for it to cause, even if it sort of was able to. So that means that the dualist has to accept one of two things if they are insisting that the mind is causing things in the brain, either epiphenomenalism or overdetermination. Well, actually, epiphenomenalism is saying that mental effects don't have physical causes, which is generally thought to be a very problematic outcome. Be interesting if he comes out in defense of that, because that would be very strange. There aren't many people who out and out defend epiphenomenalism these days, at least in my understanding, because that has pretty weird implications, like that thoughts don't cause behaviors, or like beliefs don't cause behaviors, which I think is just wrong. But anyway, maybe there's ways around that, but that's generally thought to be pretty implausible. Or if we don't go with that, the other option is overdetermination. And overdetermination is essentially saying that the, just seeing how he describes it here. Yeah, so the idea of causation is that if you have A that causes B, and A is a sufficient condition for causing B. So that means when A happens, B will happen, like necessarily. It's sufficient for A to exist, then to therefore, I didn't say that right. For B to exist, it is sufficient that A have existed, or A have come into being, or A take place, right? A leads to B. A causes B. To explain why B happened, all you have to do is say, oh, there was A, right? And we've explained B. Now, the overdetermination is saying that A causes B, yes, and A is sufficient to give rise to B. But there's also C, which also, and somehow like separately alongside, causes B. So A and B both A and C both cause B together. Like two different things both cause the same effect. And the thing is, we're not saying that one sometimes does and the other sometimes does. I mean, that's not a problem. Or like one could or the other could, but one actually does. No, it's saying that at the same time, in the same instance, both of them actually did fully cause it by themselves. And that's what doesn't really seem to make sense, because the idea of a cause is that a cause is sufficient for its effect. So if it's sufficient for the effect, you can't have a second thing also being sufficient for its effect at the same time. That's overdetermination. The cause is, sorry, the effect is overdetermined. There's two things that are simultaneously doing all of the work. That's the way I sort of think about it. It's like, it's not saying that each is doing half of the work, or that half of the time one does all of the work and the other time the other half does all the work. It's saying that all of the time both do all of the work. And that just doesn't really make any sense, at least, you know, so many people say. That's not how causation works. And so that's the problem with overdetermination. It seems that the dualist has to be saying that all physical effects in the brain are simultaneously completely caused by physical causes, and also at the same time completely caused by mental causes, at least for some effects in the brain. Maybe it doesn't have to be all, but at least some effects in the brain are like this. And that just doesn't sit right with a lot of people. It doesn't seem how causation is supposed to work. If the physical cause is sufficient for the effect, then there's just nothing left for the mental cause to do. Hopefully that was at least reasonably clear. So that's the worry. If you're saying that there's this role for the immaterial mind to do some causing things. Okay, so
potential responses
he's actually
here.
going to defend epiphenomenalism. That's interesting.
Basically, we've got three options. We could either accept epiphenomenalism, accept overdetermination, or deny causal completeness. So let's look at those options. So the first, maybe epiphenomenalism isn't so bad. So David Chalmers is probably the most prominent philosopher in recent times to have defended dualism. He goes in for basically a version of epiphenomenalism in his book, The Conscious Mind. Frank Jackson, when he gave the famous knowledge argument with Mary in the Black and White Room, that paper is called Epiphenomenal Qualia. He was happy to go in for a kind of epiphenomenalism. Now, there's an immediate worry with epiphenomenalism, which is like, it certainly seems like they're like conscious states are influencing behavior all the time. You make you have a feeling of conscious thirst, and that typically is followed by like drinking water. You have a feeling of pain, and that's typically followed by certain behaviors like saying ouch and withdrawing from the stimulus. And so there's certainly like the appearance of causation going on here, and it's not like this is just a complete coincidence. So what's going on here? Well, the epiphenomenalist has an explanation. They say, okay, we've got what tempts us to think that conscious states causally influence behavior is roughly there's like a correlation or a constant conjunction between certain kinds of conscious states and certain kinds of subsequent behaviors. But we know that there are multiple ways of explaining a correlation. You don't need to posit a causal arrow between X and Y to explain why X and Y are correlated. Sometimes the correlation is explained by the fact that there's some third factor, a common cause Z, that influences both X and Y. And so that's what's going on in this case, according to the epiphenomenalist. So why is it that every time I have the conscious feeling of thirst, I subsequently go and drink water? It's not because the conscious feeling of thirst is causing me to drink water. Rather, there's some underlying brain state that both causes the feeling of thirst and somewhat later causes the water drinking behavior. And basically, they're going to say anytime it looks to us.
I don't understand. How is that consistent with dualism? Because that's what the physicalist says. I'm very confused about that response. That sounds like what a physicalist would say, an epiphenomenalist physicalist, which I disagree with. But if you say that the mental state is caused by the physical as well, and then the behavior is also caused by the physical, then it seems like the soul's not actually doing anything. Well, I guess that's the point, right? It's epiphenomenal. But it's caused by the physical, but it is itself non-physical. I'm not even sure what we've really got there at that point. It doesn't even sound like substance dualism to me. But anyway.
It's like a certain conscious state is causing a certain physical effect. What's really going on is...
that just gives rise to the question as to how a physical state in the brain is supposed to cause the immaterial state of the mind to be in a certain state. It gives rise to a problem in the other direction, essentially. But I suppose it's at least not saying that the mind is causally affecting the brain, but that's sort of like how the pairing problem becomes irrelevant then at this point. If you're just going to go for epiphenomenalism, I guess what confuses me is that the first two issues we looked at, how the mind causes things, how the immaterial mind causes things, as well as how the immaterial mind pairs with the brain, both of these seem to be irrelevant if we're going with epiphenomenalism, because the mind doesn't cause anything, and it doesn't need to pair with the brain. It's just sort of generated by the brain, according to what he said here. But that just sounds like you're at most some sort of property dualist. I don't know. That's very confusing to me that he would. I don't really understand how you can reconcile that with substance dualism, because like the substance of the immaterial mind is not supposed to be caused by the brain. And from what I understand, it's supposed to be its own thing.
Those two things are joint effects of a common cause. So the conscious state is not causally influencing the physical thing. So okay, I think that works perfectly well to explain the correlations. There's other objections. I just don't understand.
Yeah, I just don't understand how that's consistent with substance dualism. I've sort of missed something there. I feel like that you can't say that all of the states of the immaterial mind are caused by the brain, and the mind doesn't cause anything in the brain, and still be a substance dualist, or at least it's not clear to me what that amounts to. there is a form of substance dualism called parallelism, which is to say that the mind causes the mind, the brain causes the brain, and they just sort of stay in constant conjunction because God keeps them that way. I think that was it Leibniz who said that. Some people have defended that, but that's not what is being said here. He's sort of saying they're both caused by the brain. I don't know. That just sounds like physicalism to me. I don't know. I find that weird.
Kind of lame, I think, to epiphenomenalism. So, if you think that knowing that P requires that your belief that P be caused by the fact that P, a kind of causal theory of knowledge, then it looks like epiphenomenalism makes it impossible for us to know about our conscious states. Standard reply here is just, well, there's other.
I'm going to skip that bit. I want to get to the next.
Determination view on race.
Okay, overdetermination.
So the first thing to say here is, when I described the overdetermination view, I made it sound really weird and bad. Like every time a mental state causes physical behavior, it's like a firing squad case of overdetermination. But we know that in nature, there are tons of cases of like what we can call benign overdetermination. So like maybe a scale goes down because the object was over 10 pounds. But also we could say like, well, the fact that it was 11 pounds was causally sufficient for that same effect. So there's a kind of overdetermination here, like the fact that it's over 10 pounds, that's not the same fact as the fact that it's 11 pounds. But both seem to like be perfectly good causal explanations for why we get that outcome. It's a kind of overdetermination, but not one that should bother us very much. Or maybe a bird is trained to peck at a chip whenever it's red. So we could explain why the bird pecked by saying, well, it was because the chip was red. We could also cite the more specific fact that it was scarlet. That at least was causally sufficient for the peck. So we've got these kind of two distinct facts or events that are each causally sufficient for the outcome. That kind of thing happens all the time. Doesn't seem particularly problematic. Or in general, whenever we cite like a kind of coarse-grained macroscopic property of an object to explain some effect.
Yes, but as he says in the reply here, that's not the sort of overdetermination that anyone is worried about. They're worried about the sort of overdetermination that seems to be coincidental because there's nothing that metaphysically necessitates the two causes together. So in all of these examples here, it's very easy to see what the explanation is. It's just that we sort of described something in two slightly different ways, but the same thing, the underlying thing is the same. Like if we say that the subject was over 10 or over 11 pounds, I mean, that's just different ways to describe whatever the actual weight is. Like there's no independent facts of the matter that are separately causing things. There's no problem there. It's just the redundancy is in our description, not in the phenomena itself, would be another way to put that. The bad type of overdetermination occurs when there seems to be two metaphysically distinct and separable causes that both somehow simultaneously and fully cause the same outcome. That's not supposed to be how causation works. Causation there can be multiple causes in the sense that we can describe the same thing in different ways or pick out different aspects of it. That's fine, but there can't be two actual distinct causes that both are sufficient causes of the outcome. That's not how causation works. At least
there's also going to be some fully there's a kind of overdetermination that's ubiquitous in nature, and principle, maybe that's similarly not a very bad kind of overdetermination. Now there's a standard reply at this point.
Yeah,
but there's like a very tight, like metaphysically necessary connection between those two properties, whereas that's not the case for dualism about like it's not.
So what's
the connection isn't
here?
Quite as tight as it is between like being 11 pounds and being over 10 pounds. But I think this response actually doesn't work because the same point goes for many popular forms of physicalism. So in particular, like role functionalist views, where like you count as being in pain in virtue of having some state that plays a certain causal role within the cognitive economy of your brain and body. So the thought here is, on this view, your like fully specific physical realizer state, that is causally sufficient in the circumstances for your behavior. That's a perfectly good causal explanation. Also, if you want to say that the pain causes your behavior, that looks like a good explanation. But on the functionalist view, the fully specific microphysical realization does not metaphysically necessitate the pain, because in worlds with different laws, the causal facts would have been different. That particular physical state.
I don't understand this objection at all. So what he's saying here, as far as I understand it, is that, it would take a long time to really get into all of the details here. So one version of functionalism, which is actually the version that I hold, one version of physicalism, which is the version I hold, is called like role realizer physicalism. Specifically here, he's talking about like mental state, the relationship between mental states and brain states. So the idea is that the brain state is the physical state, and the, say, pain or some other mental state is a functional role that is instantiated in that specific case by that physical state. But it could be instantiated by other physical states as well, like other people's brains or animal brains or alien brains or artificial brains and so forth, right? There's different ways of instantiating the same sort of higher level role or function. And that's not just like, that doesn't just happen with brains and minds. It happens with all sorts of other things as well. There's different ways of making a hammer. There's different instantiations of that, for example. Anyway, so what he's saying here is that the physical state doesn't metaphysically necessitate the functional role property. So he's saying that the physical brain does not metaphysically necessitate, under this theory, that there'll be a certain, say, mental state like pain associated with it. Why? Well, it does in our universe, he's saying, but not in a universe that has different physical laws. In worlds with different laws, the same physical state might not play relevant functional role. Now, my first response, I haven't heard that specific response before, which is sort of interesting. My first response is, that doesn't make any sense to me. How can you have the same physical state in a world with different laws? I guess what he might be saying there is like some sort of different psychophysical laws. Maybe that's what he's thinking about. But like, I don't believe in psychophysical laws the way that I think he does. Like that there can be some properties that like pair up mental states or functional states with physical states that are different just from the physical states themselves. In other words, a physicalist is typically going to say, this type of physicalist at least, that once you fix all the physical facts, including the laws of physics themselves, right, like the principles that govern how matter interacts and the constants and things like that, that's a necessary part of characterizing the physical state. It's not just like electron here, it's like the properties that govern that electron or how it behaves, right? But once you fully characterize and fix the physical state, there's no further facts to fix. So I just disagree. I think that that's just not true. Like once you fully characterize the physical state, that physical state necessarily has the functional roles that it has. I don't really know what it would even mean to say that you have the same physical state, but with different laws. Like, well, that's a different physical state, right? You can't, it's not like you can have an electron. It's not like you could just have a brain that had all of the matter in the same locations, but then just change the laws of physics or change one of the fundamental constants or change something else about how things interact. That would change the physical state. I suppose you could change things that don't have any effect on it, but then that wouldn't change its functional role either. So like, I think that this just comes down to not thinking through this clearly enough. I don't know. I mean, I've just only encountered this objection here. But it seems bizarre to me. The physicalist is not going to accept that functional roles can change when you fix the physical state. Saying that there are worlds that have different physical laws is all well and good. Yes, there can be different physical states in those worlds and different functional roles that go along with them. But the point is they can't be the same physical state because you've just said that there are different physical laws. You can't have the same physical state in a universe with different laws. You might have analogous physical states, which maybe will have analogous functional roles, but that's not the same thing. So I don't really understand how he's saying that there's... I think it's nonsense to say that there can be worlds with different laws but the same physical state. I'd like him to cash that out as to how that's even conceptually possible.
Might have played a different functional role and so would not have realized pain. The role functionalist physicalist is going to want to say like, yeah, the realizer state is causally sufficient for the behavior. Also, the pain is causally relevant to the behavior too, but there's not a metaphysically necessary connection there. And so, there's differences between the connection of that the role functionalist posits between the physical realization and the mental state and the connection that the dualist posits. So you could try to like gerrymander your principle of like,
well, that's not gerrymander. Like there's very significant differences. The role functionalist says that everything follows from the physical state. There's no further facts of the matter. The role there is really just a higher level description of the function, the thing that the physical state is doing. That role can be, this is the reason for this theory, is that the role can be instantiated by other physical states. So it's what's what I'm looking for here? It's asymmetric. Physical states have exactly like one functional role that can go with them. I mean, like they can't do more than one thing. But if we're talking about, for example, the physical state is a complete physical description of your brain, then your brain is in like one mental state at the moment, or whatever set of mental states that you have. Like it can't also be another one, right? The physical state fixes all of the functional roles, like completely, universally, and necessarily. But it doesn't go the other way around. The functional role doesn't fix the physical state because there's different ways of instantiating the same functional role. You can be in pain and have different types of brains, or you might have an alien brain or an artificial brain, right? It's asymmetric. Many ways to instantiate a functional role because it's described at a coarse level. It's broad and incorporates many things, so there's many ways to instantiate it. But at the physical level, once you've fixed the physical state, the functional roles and everything else is all fixed necessarily. I don't know why he says that that's not true, because that's how I understand role functionalism, and I think that that's the only way to understand role functionalism. There's no further facts of the matter to fix once you fix the physical state. We do have to understand the physical state perhaps more broadly than he does. It's not just like where the particles are. It also includes the laws that govern those particles, although I understand laws to be essentially properties of that matter itself, and so it's not a separate thing. But like the properties that govern how the electrons and atoms and whatever in your brain, the properties that govern how those interact and how they causally interact with each other, that's part and parcel of the physical state. So it's not like ad hoc to say that we need to incorporate those as well. I don't know why you would try to separate them. So I think he's just wrong here. There's a very tight connection between like the roles, the functional roles, and the physical state under a reductionist physicalist view. And that's just completely nothing at all like, I mean, he even sort of acknowledged it, but I'm just going a bit further than he's acknowledged here. That's nothing at all like what the substance dualist is saying. The role functionalist is saying that physical states necessitate a functional role, but functional roles can be instantiated in different physical states. The substance dualist is saying there's one substance here, which is the immaterial mind, and there's some completely different substance here, which is the brain, and somehow they interact with each other, and not just that they somehow interact, but they do so such that they somehow both give rise to mental effects. Like your pain is caused both by your immaterial mind as well as your brain somehow, or something like that. I'm not exactly sure how it's supposed to work. But like they're both bringing about the same effects. Well, that's overdetermination. That's not true in the case of role functionalism. It's not true that the physical state and the functional state are both giving rise to the same effect. The functional state is, the physical state is an instantiation of the functional state. They're not separate substances. Effectively, we just have different labels for describing them at different levels of abstraction. The role, picking out the role state is just, when we pick out the functional role, we're describing it in a more abstract way, emphasizing one particular thing that it does. Just like when we say that's a hammer, we're not describing all details of that physical object and its exact physical composition. We're focusing on a particular function that it performs. But there's many ways you can design a hammer and many ways that it can instantiate that role. That's a simple role. The brain and mind is obviously much more complicated and has many roles, but it's the same basic principle. That there's no two different things that somehow are both having the same effect. The functional role is just a more abstract way of referring to a specific physical object in a specific case. Of course, in a different case, it might be a different physical object. But it's levels of description of the same underlying phenomenon. That's why it's physicalist, because it's a single underlying reality. It's monist, right? There's one reality, one basic constituents of things, but different levels of description, which is what the role function is. And that's why the physical state necessitates the role function, because there's nothing over and above the physical state. Once you've fixed all the physical facts, including properties of interaction things, you've fixed the role functions. That's just not true at all for the dualist, for whom there are two distinct substances which both somehow give rise to the same effect. So the overdetermination objection holds for the dualist and has not been answered by talking about role functionalism, which works fundamentally differently. So I think this objection just completely misses the mark here. This is the other issue with overdetermination. Thanks for bringing this up. Does it mean that you can delete all souls and there would be no physical change? That's the concern, yes. If effects are overdetermined, that means that they don't need both of the causes. Like, again, we're not saying that you need both causes. We're saying each cause by itself is sufficient to bring about the effect in the relevant cases, which means that it seems you could just ditch the souls and nothing would change, which, you're right, is kind of a lot like epiphenomenalism. I guess it sort of depends on whether you're saying there is a causal relation or there isn't a causal relation. But at the end of the day, it sort of looks the same. And this is the problem, that I think the theory is just not really well specified. There is no theory about what the souls are actually supposed to be doing physically. So it almost doesn't matter if you say they're epiphenomenal or overdetermined, because in either case, you don't really have a theory of what's supposed to be happening. Is this where psychophysical harmony and substance dualism intersect? I think it is, yes, because this last point here doesn't make... I think the only way to make sense of this is to adopt a set of views that also kind of lead you towards psychophysical harmony. And this is one of my main objections to psychophysical harmony. I won't go into too much detail of that here, but the point is that psychophysical harmony is sort of like saying, it's something like, look at the physical states and how they're harmonious with each other, and they all kind of like fit together, and then look at the... in this language here, look at the role functions like pain, for example, or intentionality, and look how well they fit together. And it's a miracle that they're both like in alignment with each other. That's something, that's a crude characterization, but that's something like what the psychophysical harmony is. And my response is, well, the reason that they're in harmony with each other, if they even are, because it's sort of unclear what that actually means, but put that aside, is because they're the same thing. They're different ways of looking at the same underlying physical state. They're describing it in different levels of abstraction. Anyway, so yes, there's a clear link there. And I think that Brian Cutter works in philosophy of mind, so I don't know why he seems to understand role functionalism so poorly. Maybe there's different versions of it or whatever, but like I have read a reasonable amount about this, and I don't really know anyone who's a role functionalist who would say that you can have the same physical state, including like laws and constants and all that, but also somehow have different functional properties. That doesn't make any sense to me. Like the duplicity is the other way. You can have multiple physical states sharing the same functional role, but you can't have the same physical state with different functional roles in like different universes. It's metaphysically necessitated because there's nothing to having a functional role other than having the right set of properties. And that's all fixed by the physical state. So I think he's just wrong about that. And that's also probably why he's wrong about psychophysical harmony. So anyway,
when overdetermination is bad, a principle that
let's jump ahead.
Only makes the dualist look bad and doesn't make any popular form of physicalism look bad. But I think the standard examples don't really motivate those principles, and it's all just kind of a mess. And so I guess my feeling about overdetermination is it's not a very unattractive view at the end of the day. I think I think I
articulate that very clearly. That there's nothing at all in common between role functionalism. I mean, don't want to repeat myself too much here. Role functionalism has nothing to do with overdetermination in the way that substance dualism does. The role functionalist doesn't think that there are two fundamentally different types of substances. The substance dualist does. So how can you say that they're kind of the same thing? That's just wrong. That they're not the same at all.
I think I'm
going to jump ahead a bit. I do want to finish up soonish.
Then I still would have said how.
There might be good things here, but we do need to move on.
To just say, to deny the causal completeness.
Denying causal completeness. So we've denied locality, remember before, which violates relativity and is inconsistent with quantum theory as well. As far as it's generally understood, there are some still debates there, but as I said, the entanglement of distant particles is not thought to be a causal relation, so that doesn't violate this. So we've rejected locality, and now we're rejecting causal completeness. So, let's hear what he has to say.
Principle, or I guess more modestly, to say, this is an empirical claim, and we don't have very good empirical evidence for it. We don't have very good empirical evidence to think that every physical occurrence that happens in your brain and body has a complete causal explanation in purely physical terms. So, I mean, we'll get into some of the worries about denying causal completeness in some of the future arguments, but just initially, I'll say, our scientific understanding of the brain is still very immature. There's tons and tons we don't understand about the operations of the brain. And because of that, it's hard to see how we could have strong empirical grounds for thinking that there aren't some immaterial influences that shape and structure the brain's activities in interesting ways. It's not as though we have such a gears level understanding of the way the brain works that we know exactly how it would behave if only physical forces were operative.
See, this is what, I mean, I know people can write thick books about theology and other stuff as well, but this is a very well respected and now quite old, not old, this is a newer edition, but it's been running a long time, Principles of Neuroscience, which actually only kind of summarizes things at quite a high level because it's trying to pack in so much. He's sitting there and saying, we don't really know that much about how the brain works. And particularly he's actually talking about, because I mean, there's obviously a lot of things that we don't know about the brain. I would completely agree with that. But that's not what he's saying. He's not saying there's lots of things we don't know. He's saying that we don't know much. And those are actually very different claims. Think about it. And particularly what's relevant here is at the fairly low level of causation, because he's saying that effects in the brain, processes in the brain, might not have entirely physical causes. There may be some non-physical causes happening in there, and we wouldn't really know because we don't know much about that level of brain operation, like the low level. But that's actually what we do know the most about. What we know the least about is things like emotions, say, or high-level cognition or motivation. Even that we know a lot more, I think, than we have a lot more to say than the substance dualists have to say about anything, which is effectively just nothing. But the point is, I come back to my example before. We know an enormous amount about how action potentials fire and the processes that trigger those. And those have been studied at all sorts of levels, from single neurons in a petri dish up through to fMRI scans of, you don't scan a single neuron, but scans of the brain which show activity propagating about, which is measured indirectly through through blood oxidation levels. But like, there's so many different techniques that we use to study the brain. Now, of course, it's just like Russell's teapot. You can't prove that there's no immaterial causes there because they could be so tiny that you can't measure them. There's always that get out of jail free card, right? You could always just say, well, they're there, but we can't measure them. The problem with that is that we know, as I said, we know a great deal about how the brain works, especially at the more basic fundamental level, like individual neurons and action potentials and things. And here's the clincher. The substance dualist isn't saying that there are these small perturbations, these sort of minor effects at the edges that the soul does, right? That it affects tiny things. If that were all the soul did, then we may not be able to measure it, right? It may be very, very tiny. But that's not what the soul is supposed to be. It's supposed to be central to our mental life. And so it's supposed to dramatically affect, I mean, I guess unless you're an epiphenomenalist, which I still don't really understand the motivation for that, because the whole point is that the soul is supposed to be very important for our mental life. It's supposed to do things, you know, it's supposed to motivate us, and pain causes us to react in certain ways, and memories that we experience vividly causes us to behave and make inferences and blah, 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 all of that stuff. It's supposed to be central. And somehow the idea is that our thoughts could radically be reshaped by the immaterial soul, like that it's fundamental to shaping what those are, but without having any significant effects, without having any significant causal effects on the brain, other than like some very minor ones that are undetectable. That's just not how the brain works. We know that in order to substantially change your mental state, you have to substantially change the brain state as well. I mean, there's levels there and there's nuance, but like if you want, you can't tweak a few ion channels here and there in like one cell here and one cell there and think that that's going to dramatically affect the brain state. Almost always, that's not going to be the case. A big effect in the mental state is going to require significant changes in the brain state. Of course, you can start with a small effect and propagate out, but that's eventually going to be manifested, right? So I guess the point here is that it's grossly implausible and inconsistent with what we do know to say that the effects are so small that we just haven't detected them, because we know a great deal about the brain, and there's just no place in there. This is where the causal exclusion comes back in. There's just no place in there for an immaterial soul. Where is it? Where is it affecting? Is it affecting the conformation of the ion channels? Is it affecting the concentration of neurotransmitters? Is it affecting the voltage potential across the membrane? Is it affecting the growth of axons? Is it affecting the metabolic properties of like the glial cells, or is it affecting the growth of blood vessels throughout the brain, or is it affecting the corpus callosum, mediating the exchange of information across hemispheres? Like, what is it doing, Brian? And which part of that do we not understand enough to be able to say that there isn't this big spooky force that dramatically changes the activity there? He's talking nonsense. We don't know everything about the brain. There's a lot of things that we don't understand, but we know more than enough about it to say that there isn't this huge non-physical effect that's consistently and dramatically shaping the outcome, like the effects in the brain, affecting our brain state, that we wouldn't know about. We would absolutely know about that. There's all sorts of interventions that we do. Brain-machine interfaces are becoming more effective all the time. But also we can, for example, identify specific loci in the brain where seizures, or at least in some patients, that generate, which are the site where seizures are generated. We can excise those, and the seizures either are prevented, like no longer happen, or at least they happen with much lower frequency. That's because we can identify particular areas which are the sites of some sort of physical lesion or some other problems like disease or damaged in some way, and we can excise those, and it has predictable effects, like very substantial effects on the functioning of the brain. Those are just a few examples, right? But there's many more subtle things, especially in mice, where we can do, and other animals where we can do much more invasive tests, but the fundamentals are similar as across certainly mammals. Anyway, I'm getting into the weeds here. The point is, it'd be nice if you like gave some examples, like explained what it is that we don't know that actually allows this, instead of just saying that we don't know, but not justifying that at all. It's not as, and he says here, it's not as though we know how the brain would behave if it were only subject to material influences. Well, I would say we know exactly how it would behave. It would behave exactly how it does now, because that's all our theories specify. Like it's not like we have a contrasting theory that explains anything else better. Like we only have material theories of how the brain behaves, and they're actually very good at explaining things, at least in general terms. Again, obviously there's details, but like we have a particular, when we're looking at the lower levels, like generation of action potentials, we have very detailed understanding, including at the level of like computational models, which like the most detailed ones actually, you can use you can use what's I'm going to look for, scanning electron microscopes to scan blocks of neural tissue, reconstruct the precise 3D anatomical shape of the axons and the dendrites and so forth, and then construct an electrophysiological model and simulate the electrophysiological properties of that bunch of neural tissue. And people have done this, and you can reproduce a lot of the properties that we actually measure of the brain in terms of electrophysiological properties. And those are becoming more and more, those simulations are becoming more and more sophisticated all the time. It's not as if that when we do these simulations, there's this big black hole that we just can't find, like where it's kind of like he's saying that there's dark energy and dark matter, that there's just this huge contribution that we know is there, but like can't explain. There just is no such thing in the brain. So there's just no room, to come back to what I was saying before, there's just no room for the soul in the brain. And we know more than enough about it, particularly at the level that's relevant here, to say that there's just no room for the soul there. And his response to it is just to tell us that we don't know very much about the brain. Well, I think that maybe he's just telling us that he doesn't know very much about the brain, but actually we know more than enough to be able to say that there's no room for a soul there. At least I should say no room for a soul that causes the brain to change things. Now, if you're going to say the soul just doesn't do anything, it's epiphenomenal, well, that's a different matter entirely. Science can't say anything about that. But if it's a soul that's supposed to have physical causal effects, then that falls under the rubric of physical sciences. And we can very clearly say at this point that there's no room for that, unless you go down the other route, which is to say, well, but it only has tiny effects that are unmeasurable. So these are the options. Either it doesn't do anything, or it does things, but they're tiny and unmeasurable and don't have a very large effect. Or they actually do have substantial effects, but somehow they're just not measured because reasons. I don't find any of those to be very convincing.
And then we can like compare that to how it actually behaves. So, you know, sometimes we do have that like gears level understanding of systems. So like really simple.
What the hell does he mean by gears level? That's that phrase. He's used that like 3 times now. It seems like what does he mean? We know at the molecular level how action potentials are generated. So like, what's he talking about? We do have a gears level understanding. Now, we can't build a brain in the same way. That we're getting closer. Organoids are pretty interesting, but you know, we're still a long way away from that. But like, what does this gears level mean? It's these sort of thought-terminating cliches that are doing the work here, but it hasn't actually said anything about what knowledge we're lacking that would be relevant here. Because I feel like we do have that knowledge. I think we do have that knowledge. And like, if you can articulate what knowledge we're lacking that we would need, but it doesn't.
Systems, like I've got like a, you know, like a chain of 4 dominoes. Okay, I kind of understand the different components of the system. I know how it would behave if only these things were operative, and then I can compare that against how it actually behaves.
We literally have that. We have so many mathematical models of action potential generation in particular. That's one of the things that's best modeled. That we have the best models of, I should say. We have models for learning as well, but that's a bit trickier. But action potential generation, absolutely. We have those models that appeal entirely to physical causes, and then we can compare them to experimental data, and they match very well. Like, we have very good models of action potential generation. I should say that there's like obviously different types of neurons, and I think some neurons have been like pyramidal cells in particular have been subject to a lot of attention. Anyway, that's getting off track here. But the point is, what he's saying, we literally have mathematical models that appeal to only a specific definable set of physical causes that predict very specific outcomes in the brain. And it's not like it's a central thing. The central property of the brain is to fire action potentials and integrate signals from other action potentials to determine when the next cell fires action potentials. That's what it does. Like, that's how it propagates information. That's how it processes information. That's how thinking happens. And so his silly example of like 4 dominoes, well, the equivalent of that, we have that. We have a theory that predicts how the brain would behave, or how the essential parts of it would behave under in the physical causes. It matches very well with the observations. We have other theories at other levels of detail as well, but that's just one example. And he's just saying we don't. Well, like, what's could you give an example of like where we don't have that theory? Of course, we don't have that theory for everything in the brain, but we have it for a lot of things, and for more than enough to say that there's no soul doing the work there. I just baffling here. Like, what are you talking about, Brian? We literally have heaps of theories of the sort that you're saying we don't have. you could at least identify one example and tell us what's lacking about that theory, and then maybe we could have a conversation. But I don't think he knows what he's talking about. He either has no idea what he's talking about in terms of the neuroscience or like cognitive science here, or he does, and he's just hiding it very well for some unclear reason.
We certainly don't have that in the case of consciousness, or in the case of the brain. Now, when I've asked,
consciousness, hang on, consciousness is a different thing. Because I agree that we don't have nearly as good a theory about consciousness, although I would say that we have more than he probably would agree with. But like we actually know a lot about what sorts of brain states are necessary and underlying activities are necessary to generate consciousness. But like that's another discussion. No one said anything about consciousness at this point, because substance dualism is not just a theory about consciousness. Anyway, don't want to get too sidetracked there.
Neuroscientists or philosophers of neuroscience who know a lot more about neuroscience than I do, I ask them, like, to what extent do we have like empirical justification for this kind of causal completeness claim? And they'll typically say that's not really like an empirical claim that we think we've got great evidence for. It's more like a methodological assumption. And I think it's certainly true that this is like a working methodological assumption in neuroscience.
That answer doesn't make any sense at all. It's true that it's a methodological assumption, but it's also a testable assumption. Like, it's an abundantly testable assumption. Brian just explained how to test it, right? You come up with a model that appeals only to physical causes, and then you compare that to the data. And if it's wrong, now, of course, maybe you haven't identified all the right physical causes, but actually, we're quite constrained in the types of physical causes we can appeal to, because we know a lot about where the brain sits. We know what matter it's made of. So you can't just postulate arbitrary physical causes. It has to be consistent with what we know from physics. And indeed, it's a biological substrate. So we know a lot more from that. So we're quite constrained in the types of causes you can appeal to. And so, yeah, of course, your specific model could be wrong and you can tweak things. But at some point, if you keep trying these things and you try many different classes of models and nothing is reproducing the results, even for phenomena that you should have enough data to be able to do that, you would be forced to conclude that either there's major gaps in our physical understanding that go well beyond neuroscience, or there's something non-physical going on. So it's never possible to prove definitively, of course, that there's some unknown physical cause. But the point is, I mean, that's true for everything, right? Like you can't definitively prove that you're not a brain in a vat that's like being zapped by some crazy scientist or whatever. But there's, I think, good reasons to think that that's not the case. And likewise, you can accumulate evidence that makes one explanation much more likely than others. And so insofar as anything is testable, likewise, the working assumption or the working hypothesis that the effects in the brain are entirely caused by physical causes is absolutely testable. So as I said, it's not absolutely testable in the sense that you can definitively falsify it or verify it, but you can accumulate a lot of evidence for or against. Then all of the evidence that we have that I'm aware of is evidence in favor of this. I guess there's areas where it's like we don't know enough quite yet, but everywhere we do know enough, like where we have a good ability to test theories with precision, shows that we can account for them through physical causes. I mean, shock horror, right? Like the brain is a physical object. So like the idea that it's caused by physical things or physical causes is shouldn't really be that shocking. I guess if you're a substance dualist, maybe it is. But so what Brian is saying here is, I think, but it is true that if you talk to a lot of people, they'll say, well, it's more of a methodological, like kind of working assumption. I don't think that's wrong, but I think that Brian's implication that he draws from that is wrong, which is that it's not testable. The fact that something is a working assumption or a working hypothesis doesn't mean you can't test it. And furthermore, we also do have a lot of evidence for it. And we have absolutely no evidence for the contrary. That is, that there is some sort of immaterial cause that's having effects on the brain. And there are potential lines of evidence that have been suggested. I mean, there's a whole field of parapsychology, for example, remote viewing or telekinesis. So these would be evidence against a physicalist paradigm, for example, or out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences. If it were possible for people to perceive and then form memories of things that it is impossible for their physical body to have any way of experienced, like floating above your body and then seeing something on the ceiling that you can rule out any physical cause of. Well, again, so these would be evidence against the physicalist paradigm. And these are all possible evidences, which actually there has been substantial research in these areas and into these questions, and just none of it pans out. The evidence is all terrible quality, right? So it's not even like this hasn't been tested. So it's very frustrating to hear Brian just saying here, oh, this is basically just an assumption. We don't actually have any evidence really that like causal exclusion is true. Like, no, Brian, we have overwhelming evidence from fundamental physics and what we know about the underlying substrate that the brain is made of, from biology and about how cells work and genetics and signaling and all that, from how neurons and brains specifically work, as well as studies at the cognitive level, like those that I just mentioned, that try to find effects of the mental outside of the physical, as well as many studies like neurological level and deficits in cognitive neuroimaging, and could go on and on and on about all of the different layers of evidence and how they fit together. We have overwhelming evidence that effects in the brain are caused by physical effects. The most you could say is that, well, maybe there's tiny effects of any material substance here or there that is sort of hiding under our areas that we haven't been able to test yet. You can always say that. But what you can't say is that we know so little about the brain that we don't have any good empirical reasons for thinking that the causal exclusion is true in the brain. Like, that's just wrong. Like, that's just wrong, bro. Like, literally the domino example, the gears level, whatever that's supposed to be an example that he mentioned, is incorrect, because you can find so many examples of exactly that sort of thing. If by that he means like a precise mechanistic model of many brain processes, including particularly like the action potential generation that I just said. So to summarize all that, like, why do dualists keep saying these things? Like, they're just so clearly wrong and they don't know what they're talking about. If you can give me specific examples of theories that are inadequate or that don't show this, then we can discuss this. But they never do. I never see them do this. They just always talk about this in extremely general terms, never get into details, and don't give any examples. As someone who cares a lot about this, and you know, I'm a neuroscientist myself, I find it quite frustrating. And I think that it's like, it's easy enough to sort of imagine that the brain, or so I should say that the mind is something non-physical, and that the brain is not really that central, or at least is like only one component of many, when you don't actually know anything about how the brain or how it works. I think these intuitions begin to fade away the more you understand about like cognitive science and neuroscience, and also the like physics as well, because that's part of the principle. I'm not saying this is true for everyone, but I think it helps. Like, it helps to have an understanding of the thing you're saying is false, or is only part of the picture. Like, physicalism is saying is false. Well, the physicalist worldview involves all of these commitments. And like, I think he's fundamentally misunderstood role functionalism. And I think he doesn't have a very good understanding of why it is that we think things like locality holds, for example, in physics, or about the nature of interactions between like electrons and photons. That's not just an arbitrary connection there. They're actually fundamentally connected through as part of a gauge theory, if you want to look as to what that is. But like, it's not just ad hoc. Anyway, and likewise again here, he's gone wrong, because he's saying that there's not strong empirical grounds for thinking that causal exclusion holds in the brain. Anyway, I've gone on for this long enough. I might just...
We've got stuff going on in the brain, tons of stuff we don't really understand, but like, we're not considering...
Yeah, Brian, tons of stuff you don't really understand. Yes, of course, there's a lot we don't know. I don't want to oversell it, but like, there is a lot that we understand. And our knowledge is growing all the time. Neuroscience as a field is only about 50 years old, by the way, like under that label. Obviously, people have been doing work on the brain for longer than that. It's amazing how much we do know, given how young the science is. And cognitive neuroscience, I think, is like dates to the late 80s as a specific field. So we've made so much progress in such a short period of time. Meanwhile, substance dualism, what progress have they made in 400 years? It's crickets, right? It's just the same thing. It's how does it interact? Oh, it just does. How does the pairing problem work? Oh, there's just like this primitive relation. Well, what about causal exclusion? Oh, like causal completeness is just false, probably, or maybe there's overdetermination. I don't know. There's nothing. How are these convincing responses to anyone? Is my question.
Hypothesis that like, oh, maybe this part of the brain lit up because it was directly influenced by the soul. We assume there's some kind of physical cause of why the brain is doing this, and oftentimes we don't know what that is. But as a kind of working methodological assumption, something like causal completeness is assumed. So that's fine, and maybe, you know, maybe that's like legitimate as a methodological assumption, or maybe not. I don't know. But I do think,
you know that, Brian? Like, isn't that kind of central to what you're talking about here? Shouldn't you know whether it's legitimate as an assumption?
That even though it is widely assumed in neuroscience, it seems plausible to me that it has more the status of like a regulative ideal or a methodological assumption rather than something that we have strong empirical evidence for.
But you've just admitted, Brian, that you don't know what you're talking about. So how can you think that? Or, I mean, you can think anything, but how can you think that you're justified in that when you don't know anything about the empirical evidence or the theories that regulate that? Like, something can be a methodological assumption and a regulative ideal and also have empirical evidence for it. They're not mutually exclusive. And I would say that this is true for essentially all of the fundamental assumptions and regulative ideals of the sciences. That there's that they act in those fundamental ways. And also there's good reason to either think that they're true or think that they're important, like free and open exchange of information, for example. That's a regulative ideal, but there's, I think, good empirical evidence for why that's a useful practice. And likewise, causal exclusion, for example, or locality in the case of physics. There's very good reasons for thinking that those are foundational. Defeasible, not definitive, because science is always open to revision, but nevertheless still, I think, quite convincing. But I think all of this comes down to just a deep lack of understanding of science, like broadly speaking, like physics, chemistry, biology, neuroscience, cognitive science too, as well as it seems a lack of understanding of or appreciation for some of the physicalist beliefs. Like the way he characterized role functionalism, I just found alien to the way I understand it. Again, maybe other people have defended it in that way, where you can have a physical identical system in a different universe that has a different role function, but that doesn't make any sense at all to me, because role function supervenes on the physical state, and like that's kind of the whole point of how that works. So I don't, the way he described that makes absolutely no sense to how I understand it. So I just think that there's a real lack of knowledge here. Now, I will confess that I don't understand dualism. I don't understand how any of this is supposed to work. But I think the difference is that Brian doesn't understand it either, because he's just told me that he doesn't understand it. His answer to how the causal interaction occurs is that, well, it just does. And the answer to how pairing occurs, like the pairing problem is resolved, is that, well, there's like a special fundamental basic principle that means that it just is. And his answer to the causal exclusion was that, well, maybe overdetermination is okay. I don't really know. But also maybe there's just causal exclusion is false. I don't really know. But like brain science, like we don't really know much there anyway. I don't know. Like those were his answers. So I conclude that dualists don't know anything about dualism either. But the problem is that they don't know anything about dualism, and they don't know anything about physicalism, at least with respect to the relevant areas in like the mind and the brain. So maybe that's why they're dualists. Like, well, that's not very charitable. Well, I don't know. Go, like listen to what I've said in the last 2 hours and compare that to what Brian said, and make up your own mind about how good his responses are, whether he actually engaged with these issues, whether he has a substantive theory to offer, and whether he's taking physicalism seriously. All right, I can't help but look quickly at conservation of energy. I've mentioned this before, so oh, dude, not Robin Collins's answer. Oh wait. Neither the brain nor the entire physical system is causally isolated, so the principle isn't violated. So that's very silly, because the energy still has to come from somewhere. If there was all of this energy being introduced into the brain, that would be measurable. And if it was enough to have substantial effects on the brain, again, you could always say there's tiny bits that we can't measure, but if it's enough to have substantial effects on brain function, we should be able to measure that. And in fact, arguably, I would even be able to measure that in the experiments I do, like with functional neuroimaging. Because when neurons are more heavily active, they require more oxygen. Shocking, because see, under the physicalist worldview, you have to actually causally explain things through mechanisms that fit with how we understand other parts of the world, right? So if the neurons become more active, they need more oxygen because the mitochondria are producing more ATP, which is the molecule that's needed to change the conformation of these proteins that are protein complexes that are allowing the ions through. So you need to get the energy required to produce this ATP, because there's this oxidative potential that means that the electrons are going down to their lowest energy state, and you have to then have a molecule that is able to pick up those electrons in a lower energy state. And oxygen is the molecule that does that because it has a high oxidative potential. So that means you have to have a ready supply of oxygen to these cells. And the blood is what brings the oxygen to these cells. So when there's more more action potentials being fired, there's more metabolic activity in these cells, which means there's a higher need for a greater amount of oxygen, which increases the blood flow. And we can measure that using fMRI, which uses the properties of magnets. And I could go on and explain how all of these different things relate to each other, because, that's the beauty of physicalism. We can actually explain things. We don't just have to say, oh, this is a primitive relation. Oh, maybe it just works that way. Like that's not the physicalist doesn't work. That's not how we roll in the physicalism. But the point is, if there was all of this metabolic activity that was just somehow happening, that didn't have well, I'm not even sure how to continue the explanation because I don't know what it would mean. Like that there's electrons appearing, there's electrons just somehow jumping up in energy level. Are we getting extra oxygen from nowhere? Like I don't even know what's supposed to be happening. But I actually think that we would be able to observe that in at least some of these scanning methodologies, depending on exactly what is being proposed. But I mean, of course, this is how the dualists get out of it. They never propose anything specific, so you can't test it. But if you actually came up with a specific proposal, you could test that. And this is the thing. So saying that the brain is not an isolated system is just completely irrelevant. The point is, well, okay, yeah, so there can be energy input. There doesn't have to be conservation in an open system, but you'll be able to measure the input of energy, right? And observe in that way that it's an open system, that there's input of energy. So where's this input of energy from the soul that we should be observing if it's like interacting in this substantial way with the brain? We don't observe it. But we don't observe it, and we should be observing it if it's this consistent in the way that they say. Oh, response one, epiphenomenalism. Yeah, because that's a great response. It's really surprising for me that a dualist is going for epiphenomenalism, because usually in what I've read, dualists really don't like epiphenomenalism because they think that the mind is so important. They want to preserve a causal role for it. But anyway, that's another issue. I think this is a misunderstanding of the whole problem here. It's not enough just to say that it's an open system. Yeah, okay, sure. Then you don't have conservation. Then you have a giant energy input. So what's the evidence for that? And like, where's the energy going? And like, our body would have to do something with that energy. But like energy, and if there was all of this energy being dumped into our brain, then that would actually have to go somewhere. And so like, would it be released as heat? Or maybe it would be converted into like a chemical potential energy, which could be like converted into fat storage. Maybe that's why everyone's putting on weight, because it's all of this like soul energy that's being dumped into our bodies and ultimately converted into like lipid deposits. We're all getting super obese because like our souls are more active or something. Like, you see how stupid this is? Because like, as soon as you actually go into the detail of it, it doesn't make a lick of sense and is inconsistent with what we know about the way everything works in the body and the brain. The only way that it sounds even slightly plausible is when you don't go into any detail and you say that, oh, like there's an interaction which doesn't have to conserve energy because it's an open system. Okay, yeah, but what does that actually mean? Like, you haven't actually said anything other than there's energy input. Okay, but energy is a physical quantity that's measurable. So how come we don't measure it? And where does the energy go? Well, of course, they don't have answers there. This is a very good question. I'm not really educated in this stuff, but what does the soul add beyond filling the gaps of what we don't know? I think, well, there's two things that it adds. For some people, it adds a link to theology. So essentially, they believe in the soul for other reasons, and it's convenient to have these arguments that help to bolster that. So it's sort of an apologetic. I don't know whether that's true for Brian or not. I don't know exactly what motivates what in his worldview or how he sees that. But I think that's one thing. But not all substance dualists are theists, so I shouldn't say that that's true for everyone. So one thing it adds is a link to theology and helps bolster beliefs that we had for other reasons. The second thing that it adds is that it makes beliefs sound more credible than they are. So if you say that there is this magical force that somehow changes the way our brains work, that sounds ridiculous. If you say there is an immaterial substance that has hexastatistic properties such that it pairs with specific material substances in a primitive relation of causal relations, maybe that sounds more respectable to some people. So I think that's the other purpose. What purpose it certainly doesn't serve is any explanatory purpose, as I've already said, because there's no explanation to be had in terms of any of these. Yes, I should also say it's supposed to explain continuity over time of the self. So that is one thing that you could argue about that it does say, is because that the soul is supposed to be, it's not supposed to have component parts. So it retains identity over time in a way that plausibly the brain can't, because it's a physical composite. But as I said, I don't know that that really works, because if you're going to say that the soul interacts with the body, then it has to have a principle of identifying the physical aggregate that it interacts with and staying tethered to that physical aggregate. And so it seems that you still need a principle of identity of the physical aggregate over time. So I don't even think that it really works there, but that's maybe one thing that it's supposed to explain. I'd love to hear a convo between you and Carter on Joe's channel. He had a convo with David P, and it was pretty good. So he being, I presume that's Brian there. That would actually be interesting, because I did discuss this with David P. And that was a good discussion. But I mean, the frustrating thing is that, like, I've talked to David Pullman about this, and a lot of his responses is just that I think he's a good interlocutor because he at least won't dodge things. He will engage with you, but a lot of things he just sort of says, yeah, ultimately like agrees that my objection is a potential concern, but says that it's overwhelmed by his intuitions that point in favor of other things, which is kind of frustrating when you're having a discussion about something where someone just always lays back on their intuitions and like, well, what are you supposed to say about that? I mean, I can ask where they think those intuitions come from and why they take them seriously. But anyway, so, I mean, yeah, I'd be very happy to talk to Brian about this. I don't think much of the responses that he's given. Maybe he doesn't think much of the responses I've given. I don't know. But it'd be interesting to drill into some of the details, because I really think that this problem with a lot of the responses that he's given is that they just don't address any detail. And as soon as you try to do that, it all falls apart. So let me just quickly finish off conservation of energy here. Robert Collins claims that conservation of energy doesn't hold in general relativity. Robert Collins is correct, because we cannot actually define essentially a unique frame in general relativity in which energy is conserved across essentially like whole of space-time. Yeah, because it can't be defined for gravitational fields. What's he quoting here? I presume he's quoting Robert Collins here. Sorry, I'm just checking here. So local energy cannot be defined for gravitational fields. Yeah. So the issue here is that this is irrelevant. And the reason it's irrelevant is because it's true that we don't have I mean, this is a limitation of our physical theories. We don't have a full way to integrate our descriptions of gravity with our with quantum mechanics, for example, and our other theories of matter. But how is that relevant to the brain? No one thinks that gravitational fields have an effect on the brain. Well, I mean, they do have an effect, but like it's so tiny that it's not driving any cognitive effects, right? Or like any biological effects even. I guess what he's saying there is that it's not a specific example, but it's like a proof of a principle that there could be a field that exists for which we can't rigorously define conservation of energy. I'm trying to steelman this, but it's really just not relevant, because it's not necessary that we have a global definition of conservation of energy that applies like throughout space-time or for gravitational fields. The point is, we do know about conservation of energy for the electromagnetic reactions, which are important for brain function. And we know that conservation of energy applies there, and we can describe that very rigorously. And a sol would violate that. So what we know about conservation of energy and where it can be defined and where it is relevant is inconsistent with what the substance dualists are telling us. It doesn't matter that there's other areas where conservation of energy is not fully understood, or we can't fully define it. And this is an open problem, which I think will eventually be resolved about how to incorporate. I mean, there's all sorts of big open questions about how you quantify the energy of gravitational fields and of space-time. That hasn't been resolved. And I suspect it probably relates to dark energy in some way. But we haven't been able to figure that out in the specifics. It's not like the substance dualists have made any progress on figuring out anything. So it's not like they're in a superior position there. But the point is, conservation of energy does apply to the brain and to the interactions and types of processes that apply in the brain, that are relevant in the brain. Therefore, it's a problem for the substance dualist. General relativity, if the substance dualist was saying that the soul interacts with gravitational fields, well, we could have a different discussion there, because maybe the conservation of energy point wouldn't be as relevant. But they're not saying that. They're saying it's relevant to the brain, and gravitational fields aren't relevant to the brain. So I don't understand again, what this objection has to do with anything. It seems to come down to the same problem I keep saying. The objection is addressed at too high a level of abstraction, right? Let's think about this. The objection was, what about conservation of energy? The response is, but conservation of energy might not be universal. Okay. It doesn't have to be universal to be relevant to the brain. The problem is conservation of energy in the brain. That is, we know that it applies to the matter and for the types of interactions that occur in the brain. Actually, conservation of matter is relevant there as well. Matter, energy, momentum, and all the others, right? So it's a problem there, because substance dualism would violate that. It doesn't matter if there's other areas where conservation of energy may not be applicable or is harder to define. That's just a different topic. But the constant strategy here, it seems, is to address an objection in the vaguest possible way so that you don't actually have to give any details or look into any specifics. Oh, well, we don't know about whether energy is conserved in the brain. Well, there's lots of things we don't know about the brain. I mean, it's not like dominoes where you can push one down and you know the next one falls. Like, come on, we don't know that much about the brain. So, you know, who knows if energy is conserved? I mean, that was his previous response. Like, but that's just not true. Even the specific thing that he said about like a gears level example, we don't know how the brain would behave if it was purely caused by physical effects. Well, we actually know a lot about that, certainly at the level of individual neurons. We have literal mathematical models. I don't know. I don't know if he's even has thought about that. But anyway, it's frustrating because the details often matter, right? And a lot of philosophers are not great on the details, but I think substance dualists are kings of ignoring all the details that are important in all of their accounts. And that's how they sort of get away with pretending that they've given answers when they actually haven't answered anything. They've just either avoided the problem or re-described it by saying it's like primitive or there's this special relation. Core theory. This seems to be talking about... Oh, this is interesting. This actually is talking about some of the things that I was discussing. Suppose the interactionist dualism until the Dirac equation fails for electrons in the brain. Have we experimented on any electrons in the brain to see whether their behavior precisely conforms to the predictions of the Dirac equation? Interesting. I don't know, but I doubt it. Maybe Carroll would argue that it's reasonable inductive projection. But if your opponent's view implies that a certain regularity has exceptions, but only in circumstances of type X, it's odd to argue against this by pointing to the fact that regularity holds in non-X circumstances. No, Brian, because it's ad hoc to argue that there are these exceptions that you don't have any theory as to why the exception applies there. So the Dirac equation is the equation of motion that describes free electrons and how they essentially propagate in free space. It's not... Well, like it is relevant for interacting electrons as well, but like you have to do more mathematical work to get that. Now, the thing is that that level of description is applicable to particle accelerators. Sorry, let me restate that. That level of explanation those theories can be tested in particle accelerators, which is how we test like quantum field theories and quantum electrodynamics. We test them using particle accelerators, like largely. I mean, there's other ways too, but that's one of the main ways. This is a silly objection because it's saying, look, if you can't test the Dirac equation in the brain using like neuroscience methods, then maybe it's not relevant in the brain. You don't actually have any evidence for it. That's not how science works. You test it piece by piece, bit by bit. We know about the neurochemistry that underpins how action potentials fire in the brain. And we know about the computational chemistry that governs how the proteins fold, for example, and the different side chains and the energy states that they have and how they interact with neurotransmitters. And you can simulate those at various levels of precision at the level of a protein or like smaller molecules. You can even use like a density functional theory, which is a computational chemistry technique, or just like ab initio techniques, which actually just use which start with Schrodinger's equation and derive properties of simple molecules. So we have, let me frame it this way. In science, we don't test every fact in isolation and in each specific case. We don't test like, does the Dirac equation hold in your brain, in this neuron of your brain, at this time in your life? What about this other person's brain? What about this neuron in their brain at this time in their life? That's not how science works. You can't test everything like that. And it wouldn't even really tell you that. Like, it wouldn't even make sense. You test a specific fact against the background of a particular theory. And that theory sits in a complex relation of mutual supports and constraints of other theories. We know that the Dirac equation holds for the electrons in our brain because we know that the Dirac equation holds for free electrons in particle accelerator experiments. And we know that the properties of small molecules are consistent with those of free electrons, of the theories that we use to describe free electrons in particle accelerators. And then we know that the properties of those small molecules combine to give rise to the properties of proteins. And the proteins interacting with each other give rise to the electrochemical properties of the neurons and so forth, right? We build up. And there's many different interacting and intersecting lines of evidence for all of these claims. We don't have a perfect knowledge of anything, of course. I don't want to say that, but we know a lot about all of these things. The idea that the Dirac equation would fail for electrons in the brain would be shocking. that would totally violate essentially everything we know about like chemistry, physics, and biology. And, you know, there would be a question, like it would raise the question as to, well, when exactly does the Dirac equation fail? When does an electron become like part of the brain? How does that change it? Because the Dirac equation describes the propagation through space of any electron, or electron field, if you prefer, propagations in the electron field, where there is not a relevant potential, which is not true of the brain. So it's not a perfect example, but whatever. So the physical theory says that it should apply there. If it doesn't apply, then there's something deeply wrong with the physical theory, or radically incomplete, which points to a need for revision of the theory. What you can't have is just, what you don't have for physical theories is just ad hoc exceptions where, well, it applies here, but not here because of no reasons that anyone can say. Sometimes there appear to be limits to theories, like, well, we don't quite know why it doesn't apply here, but that's a scientific problem that needs to be resolved. If it was somehow true that the Dirac equation didn't apply for electrons in the brain, then that would prompt a huge scientific revolution. But we actually do know that it applies to a very high degree of confidence. And if it didn't, then I think we would know about it, because there'd be all sorts of lines of evidence that would that would line up. Like the properties, if the Dirac equation failed for electrons in the brain, then the properties of the molecules in the brain would be different than we would predict them to be. But they're not, right? Like, and of course, there's further problems. Like, well, how does it, like, when does it become part of the brain? Like, what does that even mean? It's not like an electron knows where it is. It only knows where it is through some sort of a potential energy field, right? Well, what is the energy field that's affecting it? Like, is it the soul's energy? Well, we could measure that, right? Like, essentially here, it is a reasonable inductive objection. Like, we have overwhelming inductive projections here. But what's his response to that? Well, if your opponent's view implies that a regularity has exceptions in certain cases, it's odd to argue by pointing out that the regularity holds. No, it's not odd, Brian, because we have overwhelming theoretical and empirical reasons for thinking that the regularity holds, and you don't have any theory for explicating how and why the regularity doesn't hold. So once again, we've come back to, and this is probably a good point to end on, we've come back to, it just does. Trust me, bro. That's literally his last point here. He's saying, look, you can't argue with me. Like, you, the physicalist, can't tell me, the dualist, that I can't believe in dualism because of conservation of energy or the regularity of physics or whatever, because I don't believe in those things. So you can't argue that I should, because we have good reason to, because I don't believe in them, you see, because the argument that you're giving contradicts my position. So you can't use that argument because I believe a different thing. You see, I believe, you're saying P, but I believe not P. So you can't argue for P because I believe, what he's saying doesn't make any sense. He's just saying that he doesn't agree with what the physicalist is saying, like the conclusion that they're driving at. So therefore they can't argue for that. Well, of course they can, Brian. They just give reasons and evidence for why we should think that those regularities hold, and point out that you don't have any reasons or evidences, or the ones that you have are very weak and poor. And particularly, you don't have a theory that explains how and why the regularities don't hold in specific circumstances. Like he says, type X. Again here, it's the same thing. What is type X, Brian? Explain type X for me. What exactly are the circumstances? When does the electron go from following the Dirac equation to not following the Dirac equation? And how is that like physically manifested? Because if it did, that would be massive violations of conservation laws that we know about, and then it should be possible to replicate that sort of thing in a particle accelerator, right? And you'd get like 10 Nobel Prizes, Brian, if you can articulate that for anyone and demonstrate that. Anyway, so it's the same old. It just does, and trust me, bro, and don't argue against it, because like, who knows about all that empirical evidence stuff? Do we really know much of anything about like physics or the brain anyway? I don't think so. All right. I think that's probably enough. Gotten worked up enough for the night. Few last comments. Oh, David Papineau. Yes, that would make more sense, actually. David Papineau is awesome. Sorry. I was thinking David Paulman, whom I have spoken with. I have not spoken with David Papineau, but David Papineau is a really prominent philosopher of mine. I have seen that they have debated. So I should probably review that debate. That would be fun. We are confusing Davids. Yeah, sorry about that. That was my bad. Yeah, Papineau. Yes, I did see that. It'd be funny if there was some fine-tuning style dependency between quantum field theory and new scientific work. Yeah, well, again, like the thing is that is what Brian is essentially saying, that there is
some sort of deep relationship between fundamental causation at a physical level and the brain, except he's sort of mediating that through some sort of immaterial soul. We've gone through an hour of this, and like he's, hang on, an hour and 19. I did skip a few bits, but there's no theory being offered here. I mean, I suppose you could say, well, it's responding to objections, but it'd be nice if we had, look, here's the theory, and here's how the theory responds to these objections. Like, here's how you render these objections explicable, or you explain the phenomenon in light of the theory that we have. But they don't have a theory. All they have is these excuses. Like, how does it interact with the brain? It just does. How's the pairing problem resolved? It's a special primitive relation. Trust me, bro. What about causal exclusion? Isn't that a problem? Oh, maybe it's not a problem. Or maybe causal exclusion is violated. Who really knows? After all, like, it's not like we understand how the brain works. Am I right, boys? And then what about this idea that, like, electrons behave in accordance with the Dirac equation? And, like, we know that the brain, we know that they always behave that way, right? Well, what if they don't, though? What if they don't? Have you thought about that? What if they just don't? Sometimes, though, like, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. Anyway, like, that's actually the level of the responses that we've had. To conclude, this is why I think substance dualism is just a terrible position. It's because there's no actual theory, and yet if they were correct and there was this sort of immaterial substance that somehow interacts with the brain and has all these effects, then there would be some way that happened, and therefore some at least possible theory to articulate how and why it happens and answer some of these questions about the pairing problem and interaction and conservation of energy and things. So why don't they have a theory? They should come up with something. And then B, there'd actually be ways to test it, at least in certain contexts. But anytime anyone's tried to test these things directly or indirectly through like neuroscientific work to see how far we can get with purely physical approaches, and likewise, every time someone's come at it through the other angle, like through remote viewing and near-death experiences and parapsychology and all that sort of thing, every time that we have quality work in either of those instances or either of those areas, it supports physicalism. Like, there's just no compelling evidence of any mental activity that doesn't have the right type of brain activity, quite specific types of brain activity. And there's no evidence for any non-physical causes in the brain or in neural activity, despite the fact that we actually know quite a lot about it. We don't know everything. There's always room to slip in, oh, well, we can't measure it here and we don't know the exact details here. So you can never disprove it definitively, but we have very, very strong evidence. And what does the dualist have to refute that? Well, like, nothing really. It just does, and trust me, broses, basically is what we have. Now, it's true. We haven't here discussed what arguments there are for dualism, because maybe you would say, look, the dualist doesn't have good arguments, it doesn't have good responses to any of these, but the arguments for it are just so strong that we should accept it anyway. That's a little bit like what David Pullman said when I talked to him. Don't put words in his mouth, but he sort of said that, at least about some of the objections. So maybe you think there's really good arguments for dualism, and that overcomes the arguments against it. And that's a topic that I've looked at in other videos. Maybe I'll discuss it again in another response soon. But suffice to say, I don't think there are very good arguments for dualism. Most of them are just based on thought experiments. And even aside from anything else, I would sort of question the relevance of those and why we should trust those intuitions. But as a theory, it's incredibly weak. There's like no explanatory power. It's all ad hoc. And there's a stunning lack of ability or willingness to deal with like specific details and predictions and how anything actually works out would work out in practice if the theory were true. All right. Oh, this is a good way to finish. I feel like scientism has been overused. Like, sure, there are some philosophical questions not straightforwardly empirical, but we have used this to go then on to, I'm going to deny the laws of physics. Yes, I think that's a very good point. I'm not saying that like pure scientific practice answers all philosophical questions. I said before that any good philosophical theory should start with and work within the constraints of what we know through science. And I would be quite happy to say that we can postulate things outside of science if we have a good reason to do so. But we need that good reason, and we need to establish what the limits of scientific explanations might be. Now, Brian has said that there are these sorts of limits, like conservation of energy, for example, but hasn't actually given any reason to think that, nor has he given a competing theory to explain how to incorporate additional elements that would go beyond a physicalist understanding. And I think that one of the reasons for this is because there's just no ability to offer any constraints in a non-physical theory. And that's sort of actually part of, I think, what makes something physical, is that it has specific constraints. But anyway, that's a bit of another question. So I'm not saying that physicalism is like true by definition, or that there's no philosophical work to do, or that neuroscience itself answers all questions. I think it's clear that I have not argued that. What I've said is that a physicalist worldview provides very neat answers to all of the questions that have been addressed tonight. These are only issues like pairing and causal exclusion and overdetermination. They're only issues if you invoke this spooky immaterial mind that's supposed to like do stuff, but you can't articulate how. And the inability to answer these basic questions or to offer compelling responses to these objections that are raised here is a very good reason to not be a substance dualist. So that's all from me. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully you found this interesting. I am writing about some of these issues right now for my book on naturalism or physicalism, which I might eventually get around to finishing. I've been working on it for about 5 years now, but slow but steady progress. But I thought we were due for another response video, so hopefully you found this one interesting. I've got a few emails recently with suggestions of topics to cover. This was one that was mentioned and it was on my radar anyway. So feel free to email me if you have topics you think or videos that would be interesting, or like questions that you think like, I'd like to learn more about this. And so I'll see what I can do. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care. I'll see you next time.